Hi, Amos Vang here with yet another episode of This is the Legend of. Before I start with this introduction, I want to give you a timestamp as this introduction will be a bit of a longer one. However, I strongly recommend that you stay behind for this entire introduction, as I want you to get a good sense of just how legendary this story is. So let's begin. The Olympics and Paralympics. We all know what this is. The pinnacle of athletic performance. We all know about Usain Bolt's world record-breaking 100-meter run. And we all know about Michael Phelps's 8 gold medals at a single Olympics. But what if I told you that there is a violin equivalent to the Olympics and Paralympics? Well, this is the legend of a man who got there in just 13 years of his life. This is the legend of a man named Kerson. Born in Ottawa, Canada, Kerson was already immersed into the world of classical music at the beginning of his life. He would begin playing the violin at age 4 and would learn with outstanding teachers throughout his life. With each lesson, repertoire, and performance, Kerson excelled and learned quickly. Kerson enjoyed each and every moment that passed in his lessons. Kerson was happy. And then one day, something excellent would happen. Something that would change his life forever. At 8 years of age, Kerson would enter and win his first ever Canadian music competition, the CMC. Not only that, but Kerson would win the next 4 consecutive CMCs, respectively at 9, 10, 11, and 12 years of age. In all 5 of his CMCs, Kerson not only won the CMCs, but he had the highest performance score out of all age categories and all instruments. To put this into perspective, that's like winning 5 consecutive Stanley Cups in the NHL and being named the MVP for all 5 Stanley Cups. It doesn't end there. Kerson would then compete at the 2010 International Yehudi Menuhin Violin Competition. This is the Olympics and Paralympics of violin competition. Despite the overwhelming odds, Kerson would become the first and only Canadian to win the first prize at the Menuhin competition at 13 years of age. Kerson's life changed overnight. So far, Kerson has performed for 2 Canadian Governor Generals, 2 Canadian Prime Ministers, the King of Norway, and 1 Italian President, all between the ages when he was at age 8 to age 22. Also, at 21 years of age, Kerson made his debut at the prestigious Carnegie Hall in New York. Jonathan Crow, concertmaster of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra and a former teacher for Kerson, has described Kerson in the Toronto Star newspaper as, quote, not just one of Canada's greatest violinists, but one of the greatest violinist, period, end quote. Let that sink in for a moment. This is legendary, and this is the legend of Kerson Leong. Thank you, son. 歡迎你哋呢個節目. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Amos. And thanks for the introduction. And it's been a while since we've seen each other, so it's great to talk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, yeah, thanks for being willing to come on. And, let's just start off from the very, very beginning. So going all those years back, what inspired you to pursue violin? And I guess a bit of a hardball question, why violin and not piano?
That's a good one. I think it started with my parents, because my parents are inherently musical. I mean, my mom, like your mom, is a pianist, studied music from young. So that was obviously a big influence in even just sort of, if it was, plopping me down at the piano at age 2 or whatever, just to dang on some keys, just to get a feel of of music already, just to be interacting with it already. So that was a big thing. But also my dad is not a professional musician, but he is a music lover, self-taught himself classical guitar when he was back in Malaysia, and sort of fell in love with classical music and had a big CD collection, what I remember when I was young, from anything from guitar music, but a lot of violin music as well, a lot of orchestral music. So that was equally important, I guess, as an exposure, I guess, first exposures to classical music. And then from then on, I think it was pretty natural that I would, even regardless of expectation, like to learn an instrument. I think it was pretty natural by then. I think for me, funnily enough, I think I wanted to be a double bassist when I was young. Something about the size and the impression that a double bassist has, made an impact on me for sure. But I think, of course, my parents would have had to buy a new van or something. So I guess for them, they gave me a mini version. Which never grew. It stayed the same size, or at least grew only a little bit. And so, I guess that was the little story behind violin. I think for me, that because I did learn a little bit of piano at the beginning as well, even before violin, I think it was the physicality of the violin that got to me. As we are, very physical when we're young. We like to move around, we like to be active. And there's something about just the nature of playing the violin, which is quite physical. It's almost as if like it's more hands-on in a way. You can imagine, and also requires perhaps less of a sort of internal discipline to sit at a bench and to learn the ways around a piano. I think that's more sort of slightly more sedentary at that point. But I think there was something about violin that appealed to me physically. Like it got me to take out my excitement and my childlike vigor, I guess, on something pretty effectively. So I guess that stuck, and then it grew from there. I think I just had, soon found out I had some sort of natural affinity with that instrument, and with the physicality of that instrument. And so yeah, I kind of took off that way.
Yeah, and that natural affinity, as we would see, would show in later years. And still at age 4, when you started violin, you already had a really, really good violin teacher, Calvin Sieb, who is or was an internationally acclaimed violinist and the former concertmaster of the Montreal Symphony Orchestra. What was it like to study with him?
Yeah, no, I mean, he was my first teacher, and I don't actually remember much from those days because obviously I was 4 or 5. But there are pictures. I mean, I do remember seeing pictures of taking some of those like those toy set chairs, and then going there and just being shown how to hold a violin. And by that time, though, Calvin Sieb was quite old. I think he was already showing signs of dementia. And so in a way, I think that's the reason why I wasn't able to continue with him for long, because I mean, after a while, the lessons all became a repeat, because of the fact that he was showing signs of dementia. But I think the impression was, equally onto me, but also onto my parents, I guess, on what kind of potential path lay ahead for me, because I think he was not only very generous with his time, of course, being already, let's say, at a more retired age, but I think he did see something in me, to the point where I guess also that gave my parents the memo that perhaps something could be there to cultivate and to nurture. But I do remember that was sort of the first benevolent, very, very benevolent, and very sort of like the warm beginnings of something that would soon take shape and I guess permeate in my life, so yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And that foundation would be such an important thing to develop, and it's unfortunate to hear that he was suffering the early stages, at least, of his dementia. And the reason why I said was an internationally acclaimed violinist is, well, he has passed on. So, but hearing that you had such a warm foundation with him really was important because, as you know, and as everybody in the audience knows, children, especially between the ages, well, from birth all the way up to really about their 7 or 8 or 9 years of age, are really impressionable. So having that good foundation really changed the course of your life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it is very good actually that you mentioned that, because I think with everything, with the importance that childhood has on, let's say, our outlook and also how we are in a way later in life, and how we develop as humans, throughout time. I think like just the early influences, not just Calvin, but also like my parents as well, like in terms of just giving me the right atmosphere to cultivate these kind of interests, or to, in a way, like to explore them without much pressure at first. I think that was a very big thing as well, like to be able to feel free and to be encouraged rather than to be pushed or to be, let's say, made to do something, but to just allow, let's say, these interests to naturally unfold. I think that's a very important thing. And I think, that I can see now as well, like just the attitude towards music, the continuing, to let's say, to continue to develop myself and to improve, not for the sake of, let's say, like feeling as if I have an obligation to do that, but just as a way of it's like a sort of the greatest sense of satisfaction deep within, and to know that also you're doing well by yourself. This whole thing, I think that starts from childhood. It's the relationship that you then have with your instrument, or then with music. Then it really does determine also how healthy that relationship is with music. And for me, I think I was very lucky at the very beginning to have that. Yeah.
Yeah, your relationship with your instrument is important, and your relationship with your parents were also important as well. Your mom, as you mentioned, was and still is a pianist and a piano teacher. She's also, for the audience, she's also my mom's younger sister as well. And your father, being not formally trained in music, but being an MIT trained expert in quantum electronics, he gave the more physical side and also a sense of structure to your life early on, and even to this day as well, as I would assume. What were some of the most important lessons that you have learned from your parents?
Well, I would say from my mom, perseverance. I think there's something about the quality about sort of not giving up, always going by your conviction and standing by it, and perseverance. I mean, that's a big thing that I get from my mom, and I always try to live up to. And so my mom, I think that's one quality that I do look up to very much from my mom. My dad, in a way, just to think about things, or to think things through in a global sense, because and also to be humble as well, to be simple, like simple in demeanor, and to just to know that there's so much more to give and to learn, and to like these things, that it's a never-ending journey. I find that's very important. In a sense, it's funny because that you mentioned the fact that my dad studied at MIT and stuff. For sure, that's his field, but at the same time, I mean, he was a music lover, and at a certain point, he did also, start to explain to me when I was maybe around 12 or 13, like the concepts behind, let's say, how a string instrument works, string resonance, and all that stuff, which then sort of had a huge impact, I guess, on the way I saw the instrument, and how they did the philosophy behind producing sound on the instrument. But I just find that there's just sort of this willingness also to make connections between fields, again, to see things in a global sense, not to, let's say, be totally sort of hung up on what is directly in front of you, but then also, let's say, try and envision what is around that, or from different angles, or from or to always envision also like how things can be better, to have not only sort of to know that, but to also like to feel that in a concrete sense, to have a vision of how, let's say, what better might look like, or what better might be. I think that's something also I got from, it seems like it's handed down from my grandfather on my dad's side, which is nice, this sort of quality of never being satisfied, never being complacent. I think that's something that one huge thing I find that I try and hold on to in life, just not being complacent, yeah.
Yeah, and those connections that you mentioned between different fields, that's a really important thing. And I think it's something that's a bit of a trend nowadays as well. That's where a lot of creativity comes from. Seeing those connections between two seemingly unrelated areas and connecting them in a way that has not been connected before. I think, at least in my own personal conversations with other people in my daily life, and even on previous work that I've done, recorded work on either podcast or broadcast or whatever, I found that sparks also a different way of how to approach not just music, but also other areas of work, even in law. Myself being involved in that profession, it's fascinating to have that kind of connection between the artistic, the non-artistic, the concrete, and the abstract. That's, well, really important, and also changes the way how you think and challenges what you previously believed in and know, and it improves your knowledge at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you kind of learn through that process, you learn to question everything, or to unlearn, constantly unlearn, or to rid yourself of previous baggage, and then to gain new insight and to know and to gain new perspective. I think that's really what makes the sort of the path of continual development interesting. So yeah.
And that sort of continual development and the unlearning that you had to do, not all the time, of course, but sometimes whenever you find an even better idea to what you've previously known / believed in, it's quite challenging. And I can imagine, especially back then when you started out as a violinist, it was quite challenging back then for that. What were some of the early challenges that you faced in learning violin, both in unlearning bad habits or not the best ideas, and learning new ideas? What were some of the early challenges that you faced overall in learning violin, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, that's a good one. I would say that the greatest challenges came after I won the Menuhin competition, actually, because in the sense, well, first of all, in a more general sense, it's sort of like how to find out, even just forgetting specifically like the violin as a physical instrument, but just like how does violin fit then into your raison d'être, like your why, your reason for doing this, or your reason for going through life. Because I think before that, I was always, let's say, someone who was very I was a naturally resourceful kid, creative kid, and sort of was someone who was able to learn quickly and to absorb things quite quickly, and to so that reflected, I guess, in my journey when I was young, in a sense that like, okay, that you get better and better at violin, and you become good at something, and sure, I mean, it's great to be good at something, and to do it, let's say, at a standard that was that was hard to reach, but at the same time, it needs to come from a deeper place. After a certain point, it's sort of like that deeper reason behind it, I guess would be the key to, let's say, longevity. Otherwise, I find that it's sort of like, okay, you're good at something, you're good at playing an instrument, so what, kind of thing, right? So in a way, and I think that's the main challenge for, let's say, people who are precocious, let's say people who do develop a talent, like some sort of skill or some sort of thing very early on, and are also, let's say, given attention, given the spotlight because of it. I think there's a challenge within those prodigy types, if you want to call it that. I mean, and not necessarily, let's say, how to sustain a career, but even before that, it's like how to even become an individual, a mature individual who knows himself and has a vision and has a deeper reason for being, and a more individual artist, let's say, in the first place. How to make the transition between that, let's say, child entertainer, child prodigy, into, let's say, an artist who has something to say, something meaningful to say. So that was, I think, the biggest challenge for me throughout those years, following the competition, because it's like suddenly you have expectation from people. You have the spotlight on you. Everything in a way is being watched, and yet at the same time, it's not like you haven't even hit your awkward stages yet. You haven't even hit puberty, and then you go through those stages, and it's like, it becomes, I remember it was a very up and down process, like lots of highs and lows, and lots of, let's say, defeats in a way, like lots of being brought back, crashing down to earth, and sort of confronted with actually not only what you are, but also like why, and like, what are you about, but I think it was through those difficult experiences that not only was I able to, let's say, see this kind of personal adversity as a good thing. That was what propelled me later in life, but also it provides fuel for the music. Because in a way, like, all our experiences make their way back into the music, in the sense that those experiences become our palette. Then we actually have something to say, and then at some point, music making becomes personal. It doesn't become, let's say, something to entertain, or not just that, because it can be that, but at the same time, that's definitely not all of it. It's not something also like it's a physical skill that you master. Sure, technique is one thing. Playing something impressive or being a virtuoso is one thing, but at the same time, I would like to think that, all of that skill and all that technique is at the service of something that's much greater, that's much more all-encompassing, that's deeper. And so I think that whole, in a way, that transition, so between child prodigy, if you want to call it that, and someone who actually has a real conviction behind them and has something to say, and uses the violin in a way that allows you to transcend it, so that you can actually focus then on creating meaningful and potentially life-changing musical experiences, or just emotional experiences for people. Then that was, first of all, to even be aware of that, the fact that transition needs to be made, and then going through those roller coaster years, I think that was a big thing. And looking back, sort of having survived, let's say, or being able to reinvent yourself time and time again, I think that's something that for me, I can look back on and be proud of, but it also gives perspective on, let's say, the continue, like the perpetual evolution that this path takes, whether it's like a physical thing, whether your technique is constantly changing, but also your mindset about music itself, or whether your mindset about a particular piece, all this stuff, it just kind of gives awareness to how, in a sense, if you want to be consistent, you have to be constantly evolving. It's a weird thing, but I think so that, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe not only music, but also life as well. I'm really glad you brought up the point about child prodigies, because even when we were kids, too often do I see the word prodigy being thrown around. So myself being from a piano background, whenever I see prodigies, I often, or so-called prodigies, I see kids playing Flight of the Bumblebee. That's like the most cliche piece there. Now, don't get me wrong, the technique is difficult, but it's more, like you said, it's more than just technique, right? And even then, there are far more technically challenging, even if we were just to look at the technical or the technique part of the piece, or of the repertoire, or of piano playing in general. Flight of the Bumblebee is just the tip of the iceberg compared to many, 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 many other pieces, like Liszt's Transcendental Etudes, or Chopin's very own repertoire as well, or Rachmaninoff sonatas, also very technically challenging as well. Yet, and again, this is not meant to disparage the kids, because the kids do have potential, but it's just that, number one, to give them the attention of a prodigy isn't doing them anything, frankly, and it cheapens the meaning of a prodigy. And number two, as you mentioned, it's really difficult, especially with that amount of attention, it's really difficult for them to grow into themselves, so to speak. To use a non-music example, we hear time and time again about Hollywood child actors who just go off the rails when they get into their teens or they get into their adulthood. Some of them end up abusing drugs. Some of them end up getting imprisoned for, irrational behavior. And it's sad because part of it is their own choices, but a part of that also comes from way before they even became adults. The attention that they got was so much, they didn't know how to deal with it. So having that support structure, I think, was very important. And in your case, your parents being that structure, that support structure was, I think, really, really important, because it kind of still, kept you within the context and kept you grounded, and also, grounded in the sense that you were still connected to reality. And, you yourself mentioning that you can't be complacent, that's what allows you, as you mentioned, to build yourself into a seasoned professional virtuoso violinist. Otherwise, it's not going to end well. And thank goodness, you went and you achieved what you've done, and you still continue to achieve. So it's really refreshing to see that kind of example.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. In a sense, I think, like you said, I mean, it's sort of, if you are put in the spotlight early, or if you are, let's say, thrust into the spotlight as a child, it does cause you to grow up in kind of unnatural circumstance in a way, because it's sort of like, instead of, let's say, being led to roam in a field freely and to discover who you are at your own pace, sometimes there are outside forces, external forces that let's say close in the boundaries, that put pressure on you. And I think that's a very natural thing that's going to happen, and people respond to that the way they will. Some people, let's say, may not be able to handle that kind of pressure. It just depends on the person. But I think, like, just in my case, yes, for sure. I mean, I think I was lucky to have that grounding and that foundation, in a sense, from also those around me, my parents, also, good mentors, people who kept me on the ground. I think that's another thing as well. Also, not, sort of to keep my head out of the clouds, let's say, or to keep me grounded, and not to, let's say, not to let some sort of sense of superiority cultivate itself within, because that's also, I've been through that stage as well, and having been through it, and also having gone through the exact opposite, hitting rock bottom, it gives you the perspective of, like, oh, there's no point. There's absolutely no real good reason to be like that. In fact, for me, that's, the essential quality of just, of having humility, of being humble sort of in front of your art. I think that's something that you take out of it. But yeah, I mean, I can look back at my journey and be, and sort of reminisce in a positive way, like, sort of the things that I've gone through in order to get to where I am. But at the same time, that path, as you said, is like, it depends on the individual. It does take a toll on a lot of people, but that's also the nature of show business.
Yeah, and it's that kind of challenge that when anyone, regardless of age, goes up to, it's good for them if they're able to take it, and they're able to have the right mindset and the right values, the value set going into it. They rise to that challenge. And speaking about rising to that challenge, your first challenge from a competition perspective was the Canadian Music Competition, the CMC for short. So take us back to your first CMC. What was preparing for it like? And what was it like to win your first CMC?
Yeah, I mean, those, the CMCs, they would be an annual thing. And so, of course, they would become some sort of like annual event or some sort of convention, let's say, that you would look forward to, so that you could see your friends, or you could see, all the kind of the local musical milieu that you became, familiar with over time. So that was sort of like, it was sort of like something every single year that you would look forward to, in the same way that you would look forward to, let's say, like, in my mind, at least, like if you imagine as if prom was happening every year, kind of thing. There was something exciting about it, because I think also when you're young, you're also not, let's say, aware, or you're not totally aware of, let's say, the idea of competition, or even being fearless, going in with, let's say, more confidence than you should, or kind of thing. But that's a natural thing, and I think it was good for that to happen naturally, in a sense. So I think just like being able to, to prepare every single year, that required a certain amount of dedication. Sort of, I needed to practice a little bit more than I wanted to, but that also, that taught me discipline. I think it was a very important, let's say, early source of discipline, just being able to go there and play and work so that you could actually have fun in the occasion, and be with your friends and run around and scream and all that stuff, right? So I would say, like, it was more of a, I think my attitude towards competitions when I was young was actually quite healthy in that sense. There was a healthy competition in a sense that, let's say, I was confident in myself, and I didn't really sort of look to my side, like while you're running the 100-meter dash, you're not looking really to your side, but you're just kind of looking ahead. I think I was always quite good with that when I was young. And because of that, also, I think it was just like to start to develop a very hands-on, a very confident yet healthy relationship with the instrument as well. It was like, okay, yeah, I mean, that was something to already develop, like the fact that, this is not only just an instrument that you play, but it's something that represents you as well. It becomes a part of you, and you don't have to be ashamed of it, because again, it's like, it's maybe not everyone in your class is going to be doing the same thing as you, but at the same time, this becomes a very important part of your identity. And so I think that was doing the CMCs, they were a big part of that, the consistency of having, let's say, an annual competition, and then being able to, let's say, go there and feel as if you do well and yet have fun at the same time. I think that was a very important, let's say, important marker in just developing a healthy relationship with my instrument, and kind of already developing, let's say, the awareness of what's possible. So,
yeah, and having fun, you did. I mean, not only did you win one, you didn't just win two, you won 5 CMCs, and not just 5 CMCs, 5 consecutive CMCs. And with each of these CMCs, all 5 of them, you received the highest score of any instrument or age category. Now, I want to put this into perspective for our audience, and also to remind them, Kerson, at this stage of his life, was only 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old, 11 years old, and 12 years old at this time. So put that into perspective. So looking back on these CMCs, what do you think set you apart from other prize winners of the CMC?
I think it might have been, well, in a sense, it's like, because naturally the technical level would be quite high, would be very consistently high at that level. But I think perhaps it was just, the willingness to express, and the directness, I guess, of that path takes. For me, I think I was always a very emotionally based player, in a sense that, like, okay, I feel whatever I'm feeling very strongly, and I'm able to, let's say, find a way to translate that into the notes or into the playing. But just to kind of like, to make a statement, to go there and kind of just to not care about the individual aspects, like, technical perfection or cleanliness or stuff like that, not to focus on anything like that, but just to go there and, in my mind, at least when I was young, like tell a story, and be a sort of emotional conduit somehow. And I think that, I think that was sort of, it came across, I guess when I was young, it came across very hands-on because I was very, again, completely fearless. It's like, there's something about it that there's a directness with which sometimes it's interesting hearing children play music, the directness with which, and the purity in a way of purpose, when there's sort of, let's say, not so much complicated things going on in the psyche, let's say, that it's just the directness with which you speak sometimes can be quite miraculous at some point as well. Even if you listen to, for example, like some other, like some great classical musicians, or just musicians in general, when they're young, sometimes when they've already had this kind of like desire to express, or this sort of affinity with expression, and not just playing the instrument but expressing, and I think that's for me, I think there was a certain directness there, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And myself, I've also gone to the CMC, but this was way after you went to the CMC. This was years after. I went in when I was 16 years old, and I made it to the finals of the CMC for that year. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Even from the piano side, and really any instrument category, but my instrument being piano, it's not just about the technical or the technique. It's also about the musicality. And that's something that I think many people who hear about music competitions don't realize. I was mentioning earlier how people talk about prodigies or whatever, or not even talk about prodigies, like talented musicians. They only look at the technique. They say, oh, they can play Flight the Bumblebee the fastest. No, it's not. That understanding of the piece, the understanding of the repertoire, the understanding of what the composer's philosophy is behind that piece of music, and also towards composition itself and harmonic structure and melodic structure, counterpoint, all of that is so important when you're going into a specific piece and a specific performance. Now, of course, when you're younger, you're not necessarily at a point where you study all that history and all that stuff, but through your teacher, at least you understand, at least not, I don't want to say the basics because it's not basic. It is quite advanced material. You understand the first, second, and third steps towards building up musical maturity, right? And that kind of musical maturity comes with time as you grow up. And the CMC, featuring mainly young musicians, is an example of that. It features great technical capability, but even better musical prowess and musical awareness and musical maturity. And it's interesting because I remember when I was preparing for the CMC, at least over in the piano side, there was sort of like, I don't want to say a blacklist, but a sort of caution to use Rachmaninoff's pieces because they were very technically challenging, but they were even more musically challenging because if you look at each line, each finger's, to put it in layperson's terms, each finger is busy, but to put it in musician's terms, each and every single note is a part of a specific melodic line, counter melody, or a harmonic or a harmonic structure of some sort. But they're all interchanging so well, and they each tell their own story. And I'm glad you mentioned the purpose of story because that's also the same thing in every other classical music, classical instrument as well. And because it's so difficult, at least for Rachmaninoff, many kids who go into the CMC playing Rachmaninoff don't tend to do as well as people who played Liszt or people who played Brahms or people who played Beethoven. Because, again, the kids aren't, no matter how talented you are as a kid, you're not mature enough. You're still a kid, right? So it's interesting because I heard about this sort of kind of caution, this yellow flag, so to speak, towards using Rachmaninoff. It's really fascinating. I never used Rachmaninoff in my repertoire for the CMC, but it was really interesting in that sense. So was there anything like that in the violin sense?
Oh, for sure. That's one of those natural things. It's like when, let's say, certain composers being a little bit more challenging, or let's say requiring, in let's say teachers' words, a more mature, let's say a more maturity to pull off convincingly and stuff like that. That's very natural. I doubt that, let's say, at young age, that you would be, let's say, playing Brahms or playing any of these sort of more even Beethoven, stuff like that, that you would be playing more Wieniawski and stuff. Because of course, I guess there would be more of an emphasis on technical ability, just based on, because that's what you've been learning to do at the early stages of your musical life, or being able to be on your way to mastering an instrument. And so of course there would be, let's say, more of an emphasis on traditionally virtuosic stuff, that, let's say, would be that wouldn't, let's say, pose as much of a musical architecture kind of question, or being able, let's say, to see melody in many different angles. I mean, that kind of thing, I guess, would come later. So yes, for sure. I mean, you would be, let's say, you would play, even at the beginning, student concertos, for example, or just like basic. I wouldn't say more basic, but like virtuosic stuff like Wieniawski, that place more of an importance, let's say, on basic technical execution and violinistic techniques, than, let's say, something that requires a more philosophical mind. But I would say, even when doing those that kind of repertoire, what I think gets not just a jury, but everyone, that gets the attention, or that actually wins people over, is, and I think that's also the in a way, a true definition of musicality, is when the playing is complete to the point where it makes you forget about technique. It makes you forget about the instrument. It makes you forget about the means of doing it, but you're just presented with the metaphysical, that the musical essence of what it is. I think that to be able to make people forget about technique, but instead just to be confronted with something that is emotionally stimulating or affecting in some way, I think that's a sign of let's say, let's take the combination of all the elements, in a way that's organic, and natural, that feels natural enough to be convincing. And I think that's also the kind of performances that people connect with the most, and people that people would pay money to see, because let's say that they would be the most emotionally or whatever transformative in some way. But that also means that, let's say, so the funny thing is, the difficult thing is, let's say, the mastery of technique is so that you forget about it, so you're able to forget about it, and to almost, sort of take it out of the picture of what's most important. It's like you try and transcend the instrument in the end. But of course, I think that's at that age, when you're 8 or 9 or 12, of course, those questions will never come, into consideration. Sort of like, just again, but at the same time, if there is, let's say, a willingness to express, like to put your emotions out there as a little kid, let's say, that takes a certain amount of vulnerability and a certain amount of courage. So in that sense, it's like just to be able to, let's say, emotionally open yourself up in front of a large number of people, even at a young age. I think that's in a way a marker for what's to come next. I find, just like if you have an affinity with just wanting to go on stage, just to tell that story, or to open yourself up and to just basically to express yourself. I think that's a good start.
Yeah, no, and that's a great way of putting it. I mean, the ability to transcend the technique and to transcend the instrument itself and not have to worry about it. That's like ultra instinct right there. That's literally ultra instinct, you have your mastery over your technique is just so well, and your mastery in the music senses over musicality is so strong. You don't even have to think. You're in a flow state, and you're able to express the music as you become one with the music as a whole. That's the best. That's like, in my personal experience, that's like the pinnacle of performance, of musical performance, because it's so difficult to get to that point, even for experienced musicians in any instrument. It's so difficult to get to that point because, as you mentioned, opening yourself up to an audience, that alone is already nerve-wracking for many people, even outside of music. I mean, one of the greatest fears out there is public speaking. So being in front of that audience is already nerve-wracking enough, let alone you have to play at your absolute best, and especially in the competition. Now you're playing not just for an audience that wants to listen to you, but you're playing for an audience that knows the music, that is trained in that area, and in many cases have much more experience than you do in that specific repertoire or that's repertoire set. So that's nerve-wracking. That's so nerve-wracking. And that's one of the reasons why you and I, in our own instruments, we practice so much, because we want to get over that sense of insecurity. We want to be able to understand and be as close to the oneness with the music as possible, so that when we perform, it just comes naturally. And it also kind of brings into some of the teachings of Bruce Lee, even. Being formless like water, everybody knows that kind of catchphrase, that philosophical phrase that Bruce Lee had, being formless like water. When you put water into a teapot, it becomes a teapot. When you put it into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You adapt so well to each circumstance, to each environment, and you adapt to that so well that you become one with it. That sort of thinking also transcends and is also applicable in music performance. I'm rambling a little bit, but I mean that's something that I when you brought this point up, like these two major points just popped up in my mind. I'm just like, wow, like actually that's kind of like a way to describe it for our listeners and also for our viewers as well.
Yeah, no, I mean I agree with you. Definitely, I think there's something about sort of the adapting to each individual circumstance and accepting that it is unique, celebrating the fact that, let's say, every single circumstance is unique. Of course, to be able to make use of those circumstances fully, or to enjoy those circumstances fully, there has to be a foundation underneath. There has to be, let's say, the physical aspect that you can rely on, not only your technique, but also physical wellness and fitness and stuff like that, regardless of, let's say, what's happening in your mind, in your emotions, in your personal life. What aspects, what elements would make that circumstance unique? Not just, let's say, again, sort of the concert hall or the people or the people that you're playing with, but also what's happening within, and just to be able to adapt to each circumstance so as to, let's say, be able to try and do justice to the music from whatever angle you're coming from at that particular point. It definitely does. I mean, it's sort of one of those things, like consistency, again, the relationship between consistency and evolution, or in this sense, being able to adapt and being formless, as you say. I think that's a great point. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. But it's all thanks to your insight into that. That's what kind of popped up the memory and that idea that came up in my head. And being able to adapt, in your sense, I mean, you've had so many years of experience doing that. And then, as we would know, after the CMC, you went to the Menuhin competition. So talk about adaptation to what is essentially the Olympics/Paralympics of violin competition. So take us through that preparation process. What was the audition process like? And when you got through the auditions and later on to the main competition, how did you prepare for the Menuhin competition?
Yeah, I guess, I guess at the beginning it was sort of like something that you wouldn't really go into with much expectation, because at that point, of course, it's the Menuhin, it's an international competition, it'll be your first. And so, of course, I think it was more, I guess, also my parents would instill in me like the mentality of just going into it as a good experience, as a good wealth of experience that you can get out of, at least, or for that to be, let's say, the main thing, rather than, let's say, thinking that you're going to win it all. And as it's tempting that you would think as a young kid, because of course, but I think, yeah, so it was just something that I would audition for, like in any, for any other event, just to go into it, prepare well, practice, and then go into the recording studio or doing the videotape happy, just keeping a level mind, keeping a positive spirit, and that being basically it. I think it was interesting the preparation before the Menuhin, because I think it was also somehow it reflected, I guess, not only the experience itself, like the Menuhin becoming sort of like a Diagon Alley moment in my life, like when you first discover like another world, right? Or you first actually becoming aware of another world, the international musical milieu, and let's say the kind of but before that, it was sort of a cathartic moment, because I think, for a while before the competition, I guess I was unfortunate to have, I would call, less than ideal teaching, so in that sense, I mean, the lessons, that lesson atmosphere leading up to that point would become so unhealthy and so toxic in a way, and becoming, let's say, more and more apparent as I look back. The more that I look back on that instance, like it was just becoming incredibly stagnant for also for my development, but also like just for my mentality in general, like becoming very toxic, that my parents decided to stop lessons with whoever I was working with a month before. And then it was only until, let's say, like, that I was able to find, there was a jury member actually from a few years before in CMC, who we got in contact with sort of desperately, because I still needed guidance. I still needed some lessons before I went to the thing. Her name is Laurence Kayale. She's someone who's still that I hold, very dear to me, but was in just basically like being able to feel in 2 lessons the freedom to, even the validation of like, following my, letting, let's say, whatever musical essence wants to pour out, rather than, let's say, forming it into something that was unnatural to me. I think that was a huge thing. In a way, that was what made it cathartic. In a sense that I think, as I look back in many instances in my life, like those transformative moments was really just sort of like, not, let's say, making a hard transformation into something, but more like just like realizing something, having like a little ping moment, and then the floodgates open, a whole different perspective appears, and a whole different direction appears in front of you. I think that was sort of that kind of moment, and in a way got me prepared before the competition, in the sense that I was in a much healthier mindset as well. But I also have to speak about the volcano that year, because that was also a big effect on, let's say, my mindset going into the competition, because of course, Eyjafjallajökull, that's the Icelandic volcano that erupted and basically closed down Europe's airspace. Basically, going to the competition, we were lucky enough to land in Frankfurt, just in time. Basically, for we were already on the continent before airspace was closed, but we still had to find a way to get to Oslo in Norway, where the competition was being held. And I remember during that time, we took maybe 50-something hours worth of train and bus. Wow. From Germany, where we were, all the way up to Norway. And so that was already, and my parents were with me, fortunately, but I think it was already that kind of adventure, my first time in Europe. And like the first time you see like train stations packed with people, like worried people and certain people. It was quite the experience in a sense. And I remember not touching the violin for maybe 3 days.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a long time. That's a long time.
That's a really long time. I think even to not touch the violin for 3 days now, for me, it would be like something that I would hesitate to even fathom in a way. And so that was quite something. But it did sort of release, I think, all expectation from my mind. The fact that I was grateful to be there. And I did reflect to the extent that I wasn't actually nervous at all before the first round, or even nervous on stage. I was just sort of like, I was happy to be there, and luckily enough, the competition atmosphere was also very positive, was not sort of overly competitive as many competitions can be. I mean, the atmosphere, but that I was just grateful to be there. And I just told myself, literally, like before the first round, let's go and just tell a story. So you wouldn't go in there with like, again, looking to your side, but you would just go in there and have and exercise your own relationship with the music that you're playing. And I think in that sense, not only was it, of course, career-wise, like a big moment, like the defining moment, I guess what put me on the path that I am on still now, like, but also a big personal moment as well. It's like, still I look back to those moments and I aspire to have that kind of, or to never lose that kind of purity of thought, of mentality towards performing. That you're just there to share something and you're not there to prove something, and so that was, the big takeaway.
That's such an important mindset because, as winning isn't everything, right? Winning isn't everything. There are going to be times where you're going to have to lose, and you can learn so much from losing because, to use the old adage, there's always going to be someone better than you. So you always want to be on your tip-top shape, so to speak, right? On a previous episode that I recorded with Scott Russell, who is the sportscaster for CBC Olympic primetime sportscaster, we talked about this point. In the world of sports, there's the issue of sportsmanship, right? That's the most important lesson that you can learn in any athletic discipline. And I think it's the same lesson here in music as well, because especially in the world of competition, but really in any form of non-competitive scenario, when you're working with musicians, especially if you're working with an orchestra or an ensemble of any kind, of any number, you have to be so conscious of your own talents, but also of the other person's talents, and being respectful of that as well. Because chances are these are the same people you'll be working with for the rest of your career as a performing musician and as a recording musician. So this sense of animosity, if you have animosity towards another musician, it's just not going to work, because what happens when you do end up working with that person, it's not going to end well, and it doesn't do any good for you. It just hurts your mentality. It's not healthy, and especially in this day and age when mental health is now an increasing concern, especially after COVID. You can't have that. You really can't have that. And music is all about sharing the beauty of an art to other people. It's not about trying to antagonize and hurt other people, or worse, kill other people using art. It's a very, very important distinction to have in this area.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, great point.
So I would assume that the preparation process was somewhat similar to the CMC process, going into the Menuhin competition, but, what were those similarities? And if there were any differences, what were the differences between the CMC prep and the Menuhin prep?
There wasn't much, actually. I think that going into it was pretty much the same idea, just that there was more repertoire. There was more repertoire to be had, of course, in the Menuhin, and there would be, let's say, the very unique, in a way, requirement of improvisation that we had in the first round of you would be given, let's say, 8 bars of something, and you would be made to improvise on that for a few minutes. So that was quite interesting. It was sort of like something that I never did before, really, at least in the classical setting, on violin, something that I would prepare for, which was quite interesting. I would say, though, of course, in a sense, is, of course, you practice the pieces, but then I think even at that early age, it's like you're trying to find a personal relationship with the pieces that you play. And of course, that also influences your choice of repertoire at the very beginning. So you try and find things that you seem to have a natural affinity with, But I would say, so within that, a lot of the work was happening just as much, let's say, without the instrument as with the instruments. Like, you're just trying to find pieces with which you can really connect with, and let's say maybe if not at the very beginning, but throughout the process that you get to practice and you get to know a piece, that you then start to develop a personal relationship with that piece by way of just getting to know it better and to seeing what you can. So I guess it was that. In a sense, that's sort of where music is different from sport in that sense, because you're looking for something quite personal. You're looking for something that's not necessarily quantifiable, but something that, let's say, is just something that can be felt, that can be transmitted. That is something that we can all relate to in a sense. It's like emotion, basically. And I think being able to cultivate that at the very beginning, that was a priority, I guess, in preparing for competitions, to always remember that even if it is a competition, it doesn't serve you any purpose to think of the competition aspect. In fact, you just try and treat it as a concert. You just try and treat it like any other concert, and you try and treat it as that even the idea of competition is non-existent. As much as that's hard, because it's a competition. The whole atmosphere is there to remind you that it's a competition sometimes, but to be able to, let's say, to forget about that and to have, let's say, a higher or a deeper purpose at heart to latch onto, just based on your personal relationship with the music. I think that was the biggest takeaway. Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, the competition itself is a concert. You are performing for people at the end of the day, so it is a concert, even in the literal sense as well. And I'm glad you mentioned the difference between music and sports, and that difference is something that I think many people who aren't familiar with the world of musical performance, especially classical musical performance, they don't really understand that, because in sports, it's really easy to see what the end result is, right? It's quantifiable, as you said. If you're playing basketball, it's whoever scores the most baskets, who has the highest score at the end of the game between two teams, you win, right? And also within that, if you want to go a little bit deeper, who scored the most baskets, who had the most assists, rebounds, all that sort of stuff, right? You can go into statistics, numbers, they're all quantifiable. Same with hockey. Who scored the most goals? How many saves did the goalie make? Passes, assists. Same with soccer. Same with any sport out there. Even in running, even in swimming, track and field. Who had the fastest time? Who had the fastest qualification time? Who had the fastest heats time? Who had the fastest time in the finals to win that gold medal, the silver medal, or the bronze medal, right? Maybe the only sport that's closest to music would probably be figure skating, because that's where there's the quantifiable, but also the qualifiable, which is really the quality of the routine that the figure skater is doing in their performance, right? And that's the sort of thing that makes music competitions so different from sports competitions. Most sports competitions, you don't have a goal to score. You don't have a number of saves to defend your team or yourself from, right? Or, to use the UFC example, you're not fighting a fight. You're not fighting to knock out the other person or to win by unanimous decision or by split decision or whatever, right? You're not doing that. You're playing the best interpretation of a performance. That's really difficult to judge. So for many people who have no idea or very little idea about music competitions, this is a very big barrier, so to speak, for them to look or to overcome when they're watching the Menuhin competition, or in the piano world, the Chopin competition. So that sort of thing is why I think classical music and music in general is a lot more difficult for people to understand. It's that barrier.
Yeah, and in a sense, it's very true. I think it definitely gets people talking, though, which is interesting, because it's interesting when you do see what happens in competitions, in music competitions, that anything can happen, basically. You know, there can be people who can discuss, let's say, anything from eliminations that they think shouldn't have happened at earlier rounds and all that stuff. But it's just like to the end of it, it's like anything can happen because of the fact that, let's say, we're dealing with something that is not necessarily quantifiable, that we're dealing with something that's intensely personal, you know, also relating to the tastes of jury members and also, let's say, the you know, one's own individual approach going into a competition, how that affects interpretation and all that stuff. So basically, in that sense, it's like you don't really, as musicians, you don't really go into, or ideally, you wouldn't want to go into competitions with, let's say, that you want to win. In a sense, in a way, it's maybe helpful to think that, oh, you are capable of winning, you know. But at the same time, it's like just still, it's more a reflection of an inner personal journey to be able to just to stand there and to do your thing in a situation like that, and yet at the same time to only be mindful of what is internal that you want to, let's say, externalize. I think that's in a way a big personal statement. In a sense, it's less of a sort of a you know, yeah, something that you can define and say on a podium, like you're looking at the podium, you're looking at the whatever it is, and you define that as a goal, but more like you're looking at, let's say, first of all, yeah, experience, getting the experience of that is valuable, but also just like personal transformation is an end goal. I find just being to see how you can change your own life or your own perspective, and at the same time make something meaningful and bring something meaningful and positive to the audience, whoever's listening, even if it's a jury member or anyone who's just listening on the sides, same thing. And you know, in the end, it's like, yeah, the rankings, the rankings in the end, the jury's decision, you know, they will represent basically its own, let's say, its own dynamic in a way. But I think just being able to care about just that, your role, your own role when you're going into a competition, I think that's the most important thing. And you never know. You never know. It's like I think it's all about goosebumps in the end. It's all about the ability to sort of impart goosebumps, and rather than, let's say, oh, like the idea of perfection, but no, but actually the idea of like being able to reach someone and being able to impact them emotionally. No.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. That's, at the end of the day, it's being your best, not necessarily being the best, but being your best when it comes to performance. And looking back at each and every round that you went through the Menuhin competition, take us through each and every one of those rounds that you competed. So how many rounds were there? And what do you think were the strongest moments and the not so strong moments of each round that you were in?
Yeah, there were 2 rounds. So I was in the junior division. And of course, there's a senior division, but in the junior division, there's 2 rounds. And in a way, it's interesting when there's actually less rounds, because then you have actually less opportunity to showcase a range of abilities, let's say, or a range of affinity or aptitude with different musical styles, let's say. But I found that it was interesting, again, like this idea of improvisation. Like, of course, you would have to play some Bach, of course, being something very universal. And then seeing as the competition was in Norway, there would be Norwegian repertoire as well. There would be Edvard Grieg sonatas, or even something by Ole Bull, who was sort of like the Norwegian Paganini. He was a violin virtuoso in around the same time from Norway, who wrote things with the same kind of prowess and the same, you know, as Paganini did. And so, of course, there would be a piece by that. But then, of course, there would be improvisation, which for me, I think was like it wasn't like something that struck fear, but it was like this electrifying excitement. Like, oh, I want to see what I can do with that, you know. And so, but I think the first round was really even if I look back, like quite exemplary in the way that I approached it. like even as a 13-year-old, going into it with no expectation, but just going into almost with like a very naive, like a very innocent look on what it means to share something or to perform, right? Like, and that for me actually remains quite a highlight in a sense. It's like something that I aspire to always live up to, never lose sight of that. The finals, I think, then it was becoming a little bit more apparent that, oh, okay, like this is getting a bit, turning up the heat here. So I think in a sense, but again, I wouldn't say that it affected me that much, like in terms of being nervous. I think I was maybe slightly nervous before the final final orchestral with orchestra performance. Actually, I would say also that the final round was divided into two parts. There would be a chamber, you would play a sonata, a movement from a sonata, and you would play chamber music with, let's say, another violinist and violist. And then there would be the final thing would be with a showpiece with orchestra. But I would say it was just, looking back, it was just like a testament to the ability to, if you are in the right mindset, if somehow you can create the right circumstances for that mindset to happen, what can transpire? Like just you're focused then on the music and less about anything else external. And that for me, I think was, and it was, it was just basically, that was all I really wanted to care about. And so maybe just the waiting part before going on stage, that's always a bit tough because you want to get out there and you want to do your thing, right? But I think when I was on stage, somehow the culmination of things, the volcano, the fact that, you were able to meet friends with your competitors, like there was a healthy atmosphere going on there. There was, the fact that you were discovering a new world and that you were just happy to be there. I think that caused me to get into a very pure state, I guess, on stage. So that caused me not to be nervous, and I was therefore able to play in a way that was pure, not forced, not sort of, not conceited, not artificial, but just I was there just to play, basically. And yeah.
Yeah. And that final round is something that I remember very fondly, because back in 2010, this was after I found out that you won the competition. Actually, the way how I found out was that our grandparents, our grandma and our grandfather, they were paying attention to the whole competition, and your mom told our grandparents about the win. And then there was also a DVD of that final round that I watched. And I was like, my goodness, man. Like I saw, like, even now I saw, I'm just like, yep, there's a good reason why he won, why you won. That sense of the sort of zen that you described from the volcano and the surrounding circumstances around that time, that really showed when you performed, because you essentially tapped into perfected ultra instinct during that performance. You pretty much tapped into it that moment. And you may not have noticed it when you were performing, but I was looking at the conductor at the time. Even when he was conducting you, he was looking at you and he was like, wow, this kid's onto something, like in the middle of the performance. And I'm just like, wow, that's just something else. And then when you complete that piece, that performance of Sarasate's Zagunaweisen, literally the entire audience roared, erupted with applause. Literally. I'm not sure if you remember that, but watching that clip, oh my goodness, like people resonated with your performance. That moment, I think, from an audience perspective and from a listener's perspective, that was the moment that you saw, or at least that I saw, or what audience members saw. That was a legend in the making already at that point.
Yeah, it was quite. I guess it was the coming together of all the elements somehow, and I do remember a little bit of that. Just I don't really remember too much of that, of the specific, let's say, images of that day or looking out into, but I do remember the feeling. it was sort of like, there was something quite, again, it was like a personal, it was like one of those moments that you do remember that where pretty much all the elements come together, where all the stars aligned kind of thing. And I mean, for that reason, it's still like one of the, even if it was a competition, it would be still one of those performance experiences I would look look back on and think, oh, okay, then that's something that the character and the sort of the representation of that is something that I want to stay true to,
Yeah. And speaking about that performance, how did your family feel when they were seeing that performance right there? The Sarasates is, the Gunaweisen. And, they for sure they would have been watching it in the audience or somewhere within the physical vicinity of the concert hall. What was your family's feeling like in that moment? And what was the moment like when you heard your name called out as the first prize winner of the entire competition? What was that feeling like?
It was definitely, you don't ever really expect something like that, right? And so, but I think my parents also, like, for them, it was also a discovery, like the whole experience, like leading up to that point as well. I think it was sort of like just to rediscover, I think for my dad to rediscover Europe, and for my mom just to be there as part of the experience that's outside of Canada, that's in a place where they don't speak really, like they don't speak English as an official language, like it was just the whole atmosphere of that was quite exciting for them. But yeah, I mean, of course, I guess it would have been as exhilarating as it was for little 13-year-old me. I think it was just sort of like, you don't really realize the magnitude of that kind of, let's say, announcement at first. It's sort of like, oh, everything is it doesn't really hit you. But at the same time, I think over time, I remember sort of like it did dawn on me that was actually the beginning of something rather than the end of something. That was actually the again, Diagon Alley moment. Somehow it was like the opening of an entire new world set with challenges, with even more challenges, but also more like breadth of everything in between, like, and so that was, I think, in a way, looking back at that, the reaction of towards that announcement, I think, was more like, oh, okay, this is the beginning of something, yeah.
It was the end of the beginning, basically. Yeah. It was really the start of something incredible. And soon after that win, you immediately would debut in Europe. And let me just put it to the audience and remind the audience that winning the International Yehudi Menuhin Competition from a violin world, from the violin perspective, when you win that competition, your life changes overnight, literally, to the extent where you immediately have concerts all across Europe, all across the world. Your name is out there. Your career has just begun. So you would immediately perform for King Harald V of Norway that same year in 2010. And then you would also later debut in Vienna. Well, that's like the classical musician's dream, is to perform in Vienna, a place rich with classical music history across so many different centuries. Having seen both sides of the coin, that is, having seen both your life before winning the Menuhin competition and after winning the Menuhin competition, what was the difference between your approach to your performances before winning and after winning?
For sure. Just to clarify, I mean, in a way, it was with the Vienna Chamber Orchestra, but the concert was actually in Rome. In
right.
a way. Yeah.
Thanks.
And so, no. It's a funny one because it was an event that was sort of a celebration of relationships between Austria and Italy, and it was held actually at Quirinale Palace, which is sort of the presidential palace of Italy. But so that was actually really quite something, and to play with Vienna Chamber Orchestra, that was also like the first of something, like the awareness of something that was so, infused with history and all that. So that was, in a way though, I think, going back to the question, there was, perhaps at first there was this awareness of, again, that pressure, that this expectation that you had to live up to something. And I think in a way, when you're dealing with something like art or with music, sometimes that can be inspiration killer. That can be, let's say, even a momentum killer. Like, just to feel as if you need to live up to something, and then the fear of not living up to that. I think that's something quite. The thought of that is quite scary. And so for me, I think at first, even though of course, following the competition, I was in sort of like Super Saiyan mode, if you want to call it that. Like my opinion of myself, I guess, was quite, as naturally it would be quite inflated, and I would be quite cocky in a way. But at the same time, I think I knew the back of my mind, even if I didn't want to confront that, but there was expectations to be lived up to, and there was an added pressure to what you did. On the other hand, it wasn't like a full awareness, I don't think. I was still sort of like quite oblivious to the fact that, like, oh, this is the start, or this could be the start of something really that carries on into the far future, or something that, let's say, takes a central importance in my life. I think at that point I was still maybe viewing violin as a kind of side thing, because I was still in school and I was still thinking, oh, I'm going to keep my options open. It was not only until, like, okay, then you would suffer, let's say, your first sort of like your first letdowns, not living up to, again, or hitting rock bottom, being, let's say, being brought back to earth, even by people who you looked up to at that time. Like, I think that's a big thing, and in a way I'm thankful for those instances, because they brought me back down to earth. So they give you perspective after, let's say, feeling as if you deserve all the hype, or the kind of the cockiness that comes along with, winning such a thing, but then also required me to start that process of growing up, and also finding your deeper reason of being, like, quite early. And in that sense, I think that was actually nice that happened. But it was more like, it was that transformation that got kickstarted a bit early. I think that was what differentiated, like, the question leading up to the question of whether I actually wanted to do this as a career. Because believe it or not, even shortly after the competition, I didn't really sort of go 100% into it head first, like, oh, I'm going to be a concert violinist. I was still kind of like, oh, like, I'm going to keep my options open. But then leading to everything that led to asking the question of, like, what does music actually mean to you? What role does music actually play in your life? Or why, or how? Asking these kind of questions for even maybe the first time in my life, I think after the competition, that was the kind of atmosphere that spurred me in that direction. It made me ask these questions earlier, so that I would then actually have a definite answer for myself, and be able to, let's say, throw myself into music making completely. Whereas before the competition, obviously, even if I was doing ACMC and all that stuff, it would kind of be like still of a glorified extracurricular, kind of thing. But I think at some point that everything that happened out of the competition made me discover what it means to me personally to make music, and to do that as a way of getting you out of bed every morning, kind of thing. So
yeah, absolutely. Those early experiences and that early reckoning of yourself is something that everyone has to go through, but in your case, you really had to go through it all at once at the same time, because of just the sheer scale of what you were able to accomplish. You are the first and currently the only Canadian to win first prize at the Menuhin competition. That's how landmark, to the audience out there, that's how landmark and that's how significant his win is. To put that into perspective, imagine in the entire history of the Olympics, we've only had one person, one Canadian, win a gold medal. That's literally how landmark that is. So that sort of pressure, that sort of experience really does wonders for you, but can also really tear you down if you're not careful with that kind of experience. And again, this goes back to the support that you had from your family. It also goes back to the support that you had from our grandparents, right? From our grandma and our grandfather. That sort of support is so important, and to, like, as you said, bring you down back to earth and to be grounded and connected to the reality of what's happening around you. You would still also have many experiences that were quite unique as well. To date, you've performed for 2 Governor Generals of Canada, at least 1 Canadian Prime Minister. I remember you had a performance with former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and then for the King of Norway. What are some of the similarities between performing for a head of state or a head of government and performances for the general audience? What are the similarities, and I should say also differences, between these 2 types of performances?
I wouldn't say there's any difference, to be honest. You do approach the performance from the music itself, and in that sense, it's sort of, you don't really. At least I wouldn't pay attention to, let's say, who's listening. It doesn't make much of a difference, really. You just, all you want to do is provide the same kind of experience, let's say. Hopefully transformative experience anywhere you go. The only thing, of course, playing for head of states, I mean, usually you'd be only playing something very, let's say, instead of playing a full concerto or playing a full recital, you'd be playing a little snippet of something. It was actually quite interesting also because back in 2018, I believe, that was when the G7 was held in Charlevoix in Canada. And I was one of the performers that was actually selected to perform for the heads of state there. And again, it would be like a little snippet of something, like a sort of a kind of a cut version of a piece or something. So of course, I mean, it would be a short snippet, a short taste of whatever it was. Every other act also would be like, there was a barbershop quartet, there was members of Cirque du Soleil who were there. They would all be performing very short acts, but at the same time, though, the end goal is the same. Whether it is a full recital or whether it's a snippet of something, you do want to, in a way, still make that communication clear, like that, to be able to transmit the same kind of emotional impulses, the kind of messages that you want. So, yeah.
Yeah. And these recitals from all these different areas, of course, would also inform your entire career, but one stands out in particular. Carnegie Hall. What was that moment like when you got the call to perform there? And what was that moment like when you stepped on to that historic stage in New York?
Yeah, that's a really, what a memory. In a way, it was sort of, the background behind it was because I was, I premiered this new piece by John Rutter. John Rutter, of course, being like an English choral composer, was I wasn't aware of how beloved he was, like among choral circles around the English-speaking world. But I mean, just to have someone like that to write a piece and then for me to premiere it during the Menuhin Competition 2016, which was the centenary of Menuhin, so therefore there was a big celebration. And we were doing it in London, Temple Church, and then we started bringing it around in many other places, just to give you the background behind how we got to Carnegie in the end as well. And of course, then we brought the piece to Carnegie, and the idea of that, I think, was there's something about that hall that, just because of the historical associations with that hall and who's played there and the significance in the culture and all that stuff, of Carnegie, that sort of imparts its own aura, its own, it has its own effect on you more than any other hall. I just remember sort of backstage how nervous I was, actually, even going on stage to rehearse, like in Stern Auditorium, the main hall, how nerve-wracking it was to stand there and feel as if like Heifetz's ghost or Horowitz's ghost is there watching you, like that feeling is a little, I just remember feeling like that. I was like, all these people who I've looked up to who I've watched videos of, let's say, growing up. It's like that was the hall in the DVD in which I saw them perform, and of course, yeah. So I was pissing myself a little bit, but like it was. At the end of the day, though, I mean, it gave so much musical inspiration as well. It wasn't like as if it wasn't the sense that like, oh, they performed there and therefore I have to live up to that. Rather, actually, I feel like their spirits enrich in like are there like they enrich me somehow. It's like they impart this kind of confidence, this kind of encouragement.
Almost like a Genki Dama, like a spirit bomb almost.
Yeah, I would say so. But to the point where it's like you just then you go on stage and you basically let the music happen. You don't really make the music happen, but you just let it happen. And I think in that sense, it was again like a very pure moment, I guess. Once I got past all the nerve, like the leg shaking and all that stuff, but like just to go there and just to have like a good time, and in a sense, it's like you don't realize the full extent of, let's say, how much Carnegie means to you until, let's say, after the fact. You go backstage, you get off stage, and then you see the posters like Hi-Fist 1951, or the Beatles or whatever. It's like then it dawns on you. It's like Carnegie is this place that, in the end, just inspires musical excellence, like inspires everyone to give their most. I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah. That place has so much historic significance and so much also minute details that a lot of people may not realize, but also adds to kind of that charm as well. Horowitz, as you mentioned, performed there quite often. There was one performance where he actually snapped a piano string in the middle of that was Rachmaninoff's Piano Sonata Number 2.
Number 2, yeah.
Oh, that was wow. And he just still kept going. And that's the thing. When you're a performer, it doesn't matter what happens. You just keep going until, you just can't go anymore because that string is now ruining the performance because that whole thing just snapped into 2. Actually, funny enough, I was talking with Leonard Gilbert, a pianist who you performed with in the past. He's actually now a tax lawyer in downtown Toronto. He mentioned that one potential problem rather, is that the old Steinways at the time, the way how they strung the strings on each of the forks and the little pins on either side, there was maybe a little bit of leeway, a little bit of give, or a bit of a design flaw in the engineering that caused it to be more susceptible to breaking. And then when you got a guy like Horowitz, who has, frankly, a quite unorthodox technique, he had usually flat fingers as he played, whereas normally the correct technique is to play with fingertips like this. He played. You would see his hands like this, right? But he would still play with such clarity, even well into his 80s, and with such ferocity and power. Again, he snaps strings, but he's still able, outside of the snapping string incident, he's still able to convey. He's able to perform pieces in a way that I don't even hear other pianists perform even to that extent. Like going back to Piano Sonata Number 2, his difference between fortissimo and pianissimo is so stark. I have yet to hear another pianist reach that stark difference. Like it's literally, he makes it from a factor of 5 to a factor of 500. It's incredible. It's absolutely amazing. It's so magical to, even as a pianist myself, having heard that and seen that, it's just like, wow, it's so magical. And that's the beauty of Carnegie Hall and what it brings out of each performer.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you mentioned, because, like those performances of Rachmaninoff, I was actually listening to it a few days ago, that string break performance specifically. And it's like the atmosphere, you can only imagine like the kind of atmosphere that it imparts, but also like, yeah, it's just, when you think of the sound of Horowitz, the thunderous sound of Horowitz echoing, and you can still imagine like it's still there, it's still somewhere living there inside that hall, and that's quite a thought to behold in a way. Yeah, but Yeah, I mean, it's true. Horowitz was an individual in the fullest sense, and in a sense, I would say pianists like him would just be as much an inspiration for, let's say, phrasing and for tone color as other violinists or even other instrumentalists for me. So in a way, it's nice that you mentioned Horowitz, because also like one of my favorite performers of all time.
Yeah, absolutely. His name is still a well-respected name even long after his death, decades after his death. He was pretty much one of the last greats of the pre-1950s, 1960s era. That was just sort of this. Before then, pianists were sort of just this otherworldly. Maybe it could be down to nostalgia or some kind of other factor more that has nothing to do with their actual technique, but still, like, their technique is still, and their musicality, their ability to evoke emotions, undescribable emotions even, in other people is seldom seen nowadays. Not to say that nowadays is bad. I mean, there are still great performances now, but it's seldom seen. That old guard has been long past, but that's why it's great to have recordings of people like Horowitz, because we get to see a bit of that glimpse as well. And even in the violin world, I can imagine with people like Yehudi Menuhin himself and other great violinists at the time, it's that name just transcends, for as long as classical music is around and still being played, that name still transcends throughout time.
Yeah, no, I actually, in a way, it's nice that you bring up someone like Horowitz, because it's, it kind of brings up the question of what just the sheer intensity and grandeur of one personality can do, not just to become the monumental musician that he is, but also to then naturally, just as consequence, play a role in bringing music, let's say, to the masses. Creating, let's say, this fervor around piano playing during the time that he was playing. Not just in, let's say, specific circles, but more also in the more general milieu. I think that's the idea that sort of a personality that is that concentrated and that unique can do that. For me, I think it's sort of it's something I think it's a very noble idea to go by, for classical musicians, and also for, like, let's say, how, even going into the question of, let's say, how classical music fits into the world going forward from nowadays. It's like, just because, of course, I think, somehow the mentality has shifted a little bit, in the sense that I think these days there's more of an expectation to let's say, be humble, or to be in service of the music, which is, of course, a most desirable mentality when it comes to, let's say, interpreting a score, respecting a score. But I think also, like, the fact that the 20th century musicians had a sort of a different way of going about it, in the sense that they were just personalities to begin with, and they went fully on their convictions. Only then, for example, how Horowitz could then develop the personality that he is, and not only a sound that we can recognize in a few seconds, or even less than that, to know that it's him, but also still to create performances that get imprinted in people's minds and people's hearts for a very long time to come. I think that whole idea, is something, I think that even, also going even further, like in the case of Horowitz and many others in the 20th century, that they played many different roles, not just of a performer, but also of an arranger, even a composer, like these sort of things, to be full-bodied musical personalities. I think that's something still, for me, I try and aspire to. Like, that's something that would guide how I would go forward, in, let's say, my musical path, what areas to continue to consider or to develop. I think that's, but of course I'm biased. I grew up guess just like you grew up on tapes of the 20th century greats, but I think that aspect, just, the ability for sheer personality to not only bring life to bring life to the pieces that you play, but also to spread it around, to be a communicator. I think that's a really great idea to latch onto. That it all comes from, in a way, it's an external reflection of your conviction, and for the idea to not inhibit that at all, just to let it out. So I think that's something I would say is quite valuable these days, and something that you can balance with, I guess, also the need, let's say, to the classical musicians, the role that they take on as well as ambassadors, as, let's say, people who are as ambassadors of our art. I think that's someone like Horowitz is a great example.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why Horowitz also is such a great ambassador in the sense that you've described him is, going back to his performances, he was able to guide the audience's emotions without forcing them to feel a certain way. And the biggest example of that is he does not have any exaggerated movements. His body moves along, but not to the extent where he's being a showman about it. All of his power, all of his sentimentality, all of his sorrow, all of his excitement, grandeur, all of that is shown in his fingers. All of it. And the way how he expresses that through his performance, the way how he's able to, again, from a basic level, the dynamic contrast to the advanced levels of playing a musical phrase, making that interlock with another one in a thematic sense, and making that logical, but also at the same time playing it in a way that's unplayed before, unlike anyone who has come before him and even after him who has played that specific phrase, and being able to play both a conventional and unconventional way in a way that's able to translate through the piano towards the audience. That is something that is greatly, greatly, greatly difficult to master for any musician of any level, even for the highest levels. He is able to maintain the momentum of the piece, of whatever he's playing, and he doesn't have to go presto. He just has to go just even largo, or maybe larghetto. Yet, he's still able to dial it from 0 to 100 almost immediately. And you see that again in the Rachmaninoff Piano Sonata number 2, with his second movement and his third movement in particular. My goodness, just listening to that and even comparing it to other performances. And don't get me wrong, those other performances are also really good, really amazing. But just hearing it, you just feel it. You just feel so different. You're just instantly mesmerized. And even in today's days with YouTube, being able to go jump forwards and backwards in a performance within seconds, maybe even within 1 second, you feel it. You really do. Like if you're really paying attention, man, it's just, you're able to feel it immediately. And that's something that is, I'm trying to convey in a way for the non-trained audience, for those in the audience who aren't necessarily as familiar with the world of classical music. I'm trying to explain it to them. It's really difficult to do it though without actually playing, the performance itself. It's so difficult, but that's what's so fascinating about it. You can't even describe it with words. Where words end, music begins. That's the sort of
absolutely.
That's the sort of predicament that we find. It's a beautiful predicament.
Yeah, and in a sense, it's sort of like the fact that it's beyond words makes it very hard to explain with words in a way. But in a sense, it's sort of, in the end, I guess, performance is there to be felt, not necessarily need to be, you don't need to really understand it first, as if to feel it first. I think that's the main thing. But it's great. It's great that actually that you mentioned sort of Horowitz's economy of movement. I think for me, like just the immense dynamic range and colors that he's able to produce in such a way that's incredibly efficient and incredibly noble as well. I think that's, in a sense, it's sort of the absence, again, as you mentioned, of external superficialities, of showmanship, of that sense, unnecessary movements that's just, let's say, for the sake of movement. I think that the lack of that, I think, is, as much as it seems, uneventful at first, but I think it's a sign of nobility, it's a sign of poise, it's a sign of elegance, and it's a sign of sincerity, I think, so that sort of to what extent something can be done with the least amount of effort possible or the least amount of movement. That immediately imparts a feeling of sincerity, of honesty, and that's something about Horowitz, and that, for sure, I mean, his sound was incredibly, like, in addition to colorful and to deep and to just all-encompassing, but it was also incredibly bombastic and incredibly large and grand. But at the same time, it's like, in the end of the day, is you think about character, not virtuosity. Virtuosity becomes like a byproduct. When you think about what pure is impressive, let's say speed-wise or technique-wise and stuff like that, that becomes not the main focus, but the main focus becomes character, becomes being able to bring out the character of each piece, color, to be able to almost give the illusion of a singing voice. All this stuff, even a violinist can learn from a pianist, and of course from voices, from the actual voice itself, for sure, from singers. But I think something like, it's interesting how we're talking about Horowitz, because it's great. I mean, I love, this is, it's great to talk about Horowitz because he really was someone who both spoke and sang playing his instrument, and that's something that actually all violinists can learn from, I find. But yeah, in the end, I think it's that emphasis of character over virtuosity, and the fact that in the end, for the listener, that it is something just to be felt first, to go with your gut feeling, to go with the initial responses that you have towards the music. There's no need to, let's say, to be worried about, let's say, understanding what you are making sense necessarily of what you're hearing, but just to feel it. And I think that's the main appeal. I guess that's the main thing that a lot of people can take out of, let's say, a classical experience, maybe for the first time. It's just there to be perceived, and it's just there to be felt. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a fascinating way how you talked about character coming before virtuosity, and even being far more important than virtuosity. That's a great way of putting it, because even in some marketing for some classical musicians, not all the time, just sometimes, and it's not meant to be a slight or to bash them. I get it, where they're coming from. They focus a lot on virtuosity, but they don't really focus as much on the character, right? I'm not saying they don't focus on the character. I'm just saying that sometimes the virtuosity kind of takes like a 60-40 or 60% of the attention over character, which becomes a little problematic, because then it kind of, well, it I don't want to say it cheapens it. It doesn't cheapen it, but it just kind of doesn't make it. It makes it a little bit disingenuous, so to speak. So it's not really a problem. It's like a big problem, but it's just there. It's something that it's like a minor flaw that they could probably tweak a little bit, and it doesn't happen all the time. But that's something that I've noticed once in a while whenever I see some concerts being marketed here in Canada, having lived here and seeing most concerts here in Canada. The ability to feel, and the ability of not having to, you don't have to understand it, but being able to feel it. It's funny because actually, on a semi-related note, I came out of watching Tenet, the movie Tenet, with Christopher Nolan, and that's one of the things he talked about in his movie. You don't have to understand everything that's happening in Tenet. You just have to feel it, right? That's And interestingly enough, at least in that movie, and I think it's also transferable even in the classical music, sometimes you understand it by feeling it, right? So, not to spoil anything in Tenet, although I think it's actually kind of impossible to spoil Tenet, given just how non-linear the entire story is. The ability to to feel the timeline traverse, and how to invert yourself and act in a palindromic way, and going backwards in time and inverting yourself and then reinverting and then conducting some kind of a temporal pincer movement or a palindromic movement, so to speak, with yourself and with your other inverted versions, and traversing a paradox, making a paradox make sense. That's something, being able to feel that helps you to understand it. That's at least how I did when I first watched that movie. And that's the same thing here in classical music with really much of the repertoire, because sometimes you don't have access to the philosophy or the written letters or the written treatises of the composers. And even if you do, maybe it doesn't go that deep into that particular piece. But you kind of interpret and you feel it, and then you understand it by feeling it and playing it, practicing it, of course, and performing it eventually, at least from my own personal experience. That sort of thing allows you to understand it. And that's when you're able to explain it with words to other people who are trying to understand it. At least that's how I find it. It's a beautiful coincidence, actually, since you mentioned it that way. It's a beautiful coincidence that I think you and I have experienced in our own lives. You, of course, way more than I could ever hope to experience, of course. But that's the fascinating part about it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Yeah, so there's something about it that, something that I feel like there's always going to be some sort of inherent understanding. Let's say when you do construct, let's say, a musical phrase in a certain way, or that you play a sound and you play with a certain intention in context with other sounds, that, and especially with violin. Of course, with piano, it's also, it's slightly, but with violin, because there is the direct association with, let's say, the human voice, but not just in like a singing, not just in a singing context, but also, let's say, the kind of noises and the kind of gestures, vocal gestures that we do just to communicate in real life when we speak. Not only even when we speak, but even like the sounds that come out. Where even, let's say, we're talking over Zoom or we're talking over telephone, that there's the ability to discern emotion, like what the other person is feeling at that particular moment, because there are certain emotional markers in the sound that we make with our voices that immediately, let's say, are universally comprehensible. Like, oh, that person is feeling this way or that way at this particular point. And I feel like there's a very interesting correlation with the violin that could happen. In the sense that, like, which is interesting for me, because personally I find that's actually something that is sort of the high goal, in a way, for me personally, is to get, let's say, to an increasing resolution of sound, so that you actually get to, let's say, the kind of resolution to where you can perceive the sound as if you're perceiving a human voice, and that little details of sound were actually intended. All those little details were there in order to, let's say, support the color or the kind of phrasing or the kind of impact that you're trying to convey. In that sense, I think it's when it does become, let's say, that detailed or that complex, it also becomes simple, because in the same way that, let's say, it becomes more simple because when we hear someone speak, we can then discern their emotional state. In the same way, it's sort of like, it's a weird thing, but I feel like, let's say, if we are able to play a phrase in such a way with such detail and with such intention, I just feel like there's always going to be some sort of universal understanding, and everyone's going to react to it differently, but I think that it's going to hit in a universal way. And so, in that sense, it's really like that's really all it is. It's something that makes an emotional impression on you, and that itself is valuable. That itself is actually what is the currency here in a way, much more than people might think. That the fact that, let's say, you're able to, you're just able to feel things, let's say, otherwise that you would have to spoken to at length, let's say, in a particular way, even strong emotions. But then the fact that it's music, that is able to, let's say, even raw, even very direct gestures of emotion, visceral emotions, can be made into something that is just inherently more, made into art, basically. And that's a beautiful idea. Yeah.
Yeah. That's also transferable into a non-musical and non-artistic sphere as well. Speaking as a lawyer, we see this even in the courts. We see this even in the courts. When COVID first hit and everything was moved on to Zoom, it was difficult, not only because we had to move things from an administrative part, but also from a human perspective, we lost a lot of those nuances over Zoom, right? It's better than nothing, of course. It's probably the best thing aside from an in-person meeting or an in-person court appearance. But having that interpersonal kind of connection and being able to pick up on those nuances, that's important for resolving a case in law. And especially in litigation types of practice areas like family law or criminal law or civil litigation, these are fundamental to determining whether you can settle this case right now or you'll have to go to trial. And that could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially for clients. And on top of that, could also cost many more months or even many more years of suffering for a lot of these clients. So having that kind of connection, being able to be sympathetic and empathetic towards these emotions and having that access is so important, not only from a personal standpoint, but also from a structural standpoint, whatever we're doing here in law. And again, I find that parallel so fascinating and important, because that's literally that's also kind of my daily work on a Monday to Friday basis.
Yeah. No, I think in the same way that like these little details that you sense can make a huge impact in the case that you're working on. I think that in the same way that little musical nuances and little details can and do have meaning, if you so want them to. And in that sense, I think it's a very interesting parallel, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. And to be able to have these kinds of sensitivities, these abilities of recognizing emotion, recognizing musicality, this all comes down to practice. For everyone out there, everybody can agree that practice is it is the most important thing to do in any discipline, especially in music. So on your YouTube channel, and for those of you who don't know, please subscribe to Kerson Leong on YouTube. On his YouTube channel, you spoke about a very specific practice method. That's the 10-15-20 method. So to briefly explain it, first, practice for 10 minutes only, 10 quality minutes rather. Then put down the fiddle for 10 minutes and then mentally focus on the music while relaxing. So you image train, basically, like Frieza, basically. Then you practice 15 minutes of fully focused, high-intensity practice. Then put it down for 5. Then practice for 20, so on and so forth. This is what you call incremental practice for about an hour. And you also talk about the true question of how many times you should practice in a day, specifically how many sessions of reasonable length separated by carefully allotted breaks away from the instrument. How did you come across the 10-15-20 formula of practice, and why are breaks so important for practice?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's, I think partly it was travel based, because when you're traveling for concerts and when you're jumping between place to place, airports to airports, you don't necessarily have as much time to work. Obviously, you don't have as much time as you would like to practice. And so you end up making use of, let's say, less time and making the most out of it. I think that was the basis for that, but also just being lazy. I think that was equally like, whether it's, that's just the nature of it. Sometimes you would work for 10 minutes and then you would kind of like go back. And on the other hand, though, there is this idea of refreshing, somehow letting whatever internal processes make their difference or take their course, even when you're not with the instrument. Like in a sense, I find that it's like to be able to refresh yourself mentally in order to be a sponge, in order to better internalize what you practice. If you do that consistently, imagine with those refreshing breaks, let's say, how much more you can be, first of all, fresh, but also if you take into account also, like in my experience at least, every time you take up the instrument again, something is different. Whether you played for 5 minutes, 5 intense minutes, or whether you played for 25 minutes, or whether you played for 2.5 hours straight, But every time you take a break after that and you come back, something's different. Something's immediately like internalized, something that has added to your arsenal, something that is there that wasn't there before, And so in that sense, it's like, why not? Why do you even have to? If that's the case, then why do you actually have to practice 4 hours in a row? And let your brain get tired and all that stuff, right? And so this whole idea came out of that. It was like just asking me the question, like, in order to get that process of input, then let it absorb, input, then let it absorb, and then you build on top of that. It's like, it just became, it seemed to me like quite an efficient way to go about it. Yeah, and also very compatible with sometimes, like if you do travel, or sometimes when you don't play for a few days and you get back into shape, it's a great way to do it, because it's like you're constantly allowing yourself to not get worn down by the process. It's like you're constantly working in periods of time that allow you to be at your most perceptive, your most involved. And then just as you are, let's say, not or losing concentration, then you take a break and you regain that concentration. I think that's a great idea in a way.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned the importance of staying refreshed, because that's a lesson that I think even non-musicians can take in their own personal life. Being able to work and understand where your best productivity moments of the day are, and then refreshing that constantly, that allows for more productivity and also allows you for also a healthier mindset as well. If you're just grinding away, and no, you don't give any breaks, you won't learn much. You actually start getting weaker and also less less able to absorb things like a sponge, right? So nailing that quality and quantity of practice is really, and I think the 10 to 15, 20 formula practice is really good because of that ability to refresh. And while you practice, how do you determine the proper way of approaching specific musical phrases in a specific piece? And how do you determine the best way to make these phrases make sense? And it's probably great if you can give like a musical example, a passage from your repertoire to do that. So how do you determine like the best logical way to connect all these different phrases?
It's a very good and very personal question in a way, because it's I think everyone, again, phrasing is something that is, you can recognize good or even great phrasing, but you can't necessarily describe why or describe how. It's one of those things that it's almost primal, in the sense that, like, there's something that reaches a level of complexity that it becomes simple and that feels natural, in a sense that, like, every single phrase has a life, or has a birth, has a life, and has let's say, a decay or a death, or there's a natural life cycle going there. I find that actually approaching it maybe from a general perspective, almost imagining, let's say, if there was a field of gravity underneath the notes, and what, let's say, what purpose the notes in relation to each other play. What purpose do they play? Whether to bring us forward, whether to create, let's say, a space, whether to, let's say, become more viscous, create a little bit more density in the air around you, like to in a way visualize like that. For me, just in terms of like feeling that in every phrase there's a push and pull, under every note there's a push and pull, and to feel as if like, okay, that if you do feel this field of gravity underneath, it's like, and you start to decipher, okay, like what, you start to work inwards then. It's like you work general first, then you work details. It's like, okay, what, in order to create that feeling of, let's say, the phrase landing in the way that I want, what purpose does each note play? And then you can start thinking about timing, and then you can start thinking about pacing and all these things. Because the way you time it, whether, let's say, if you have like a slight, like if within, let's say, the rhythmic flexibility of course, we are afforded as relatively as classical musicians, there are ways in which you can alter that sense of that push and pull underneath, right? There's like, you can pull us forward, you can pull us back, or it can be something suspended, like in a way it's useful even just to work in these more simplistic terms, when doing phrasing. But I would say other than that, it's like, that would be the degree to which I would try and explain to myself what's happening. But then it's like, then you just sort of, the end goal is to try and get something to sound as natural as possible. So it has a lot to do with proportion as well. So let's say, going back to someone like Horowitz, even if he did have, let's say, a huge dynamic range and even more contrast within a phrase than, let's say, most pianists, everything was considered, like, in a sense, there was proportion the sense of proportion was so well considered, in a sense that it was not only in a horizontal way, pacing, how that combined with dynamics, but even if you were able to perceive that the dynamic range was great, that the contrast within was so vivid, that you wouldn't necessarily go out of a phrase thinking, oh, I just ate too much chocolate cake, or I was only like drinking diet water, or like eating sugar, like those kind of feelings. There would be something really well consolidated. Like there's something that felt natural, in the sense that you could see it from many different angles, and it just lands naturally, like the way that it does. And I think that's in a way the end goal. So in a sense, just like, even if you have it's hard. I mean, it's hard to go into examples, but even just maybe, taking the beginning of like how Horowitz would play the first Chopin ballade, like the very opening, pacing wise, how to sow doubt, how to create suspense, how to maintain a flow, and yet at the same time almost bring us forward, let's say, rather cautiously, because we don't know exactly where we are yet, like all those, that kind of thing. When it comes to working phrasing, it's like you work with certain possibilities, first of timing, let's say, you combine it with color, with dynamics and stuff, and you always try and question yourself whether that's too much, like in relation to what you're trying to accomplish, whether that's too much, or whether, let's say, something was a little out of place within the phrase, and then you work backwards like that. And that's actually also how you develop restraint, which is an incredibly important quality when making music. It's like, because there's always, for even like personal selfish reasons, you can go overboard because it feels good. It feels good to, let's say, indulge in a fortissimo, or to indulge in something that's just bombastic and that makes you feel as if like it fulfills what your adrenaline asks for. But at the same time, restraint is there. I mean, it's important because you still want everything proportionally, everything to feel as if it was meant to be, and not to be, let's say, out of place. You see, something that happens to, and then you feel like, okay, but where was that? Let's say in the overall context of things. So that's a little bit of, I guess, my thought process to phrasing, because otherwise it's an art that's very hard to explain, as you've mentioned before. Like, it's just something that's very difficult to combine the elements together, but it just comes from experience in a way. It's like the more you listen to, like, imagine if you're really convinced by the delivery of speech. You're really convinced by the diction, but the sincerity by which they delivered that speech. There are markers for that sincerity. There are things in that speech, there are qualities, let's say, within the diction and all that stuff that make you feel as if it was sincere. And that, I think, has to do with proportion as well. Has to do with the balance of, of elements. And I think very much the same thing with musical phrasing.
Yeah, that's an excellent explanation of it. That's, I think, the best explanation that I've ever heard from anywhere, honestly. And I think the audience would, or I hope the audience would be very grateful for that, because that is a very, very good primer into what the musical mind goes into phrasing. I'm glad you brought up the analogy of diction in speech. Myself, working also, my other hobbies as a sports announcer, that's one of the things that we do as well, even in the world of announcing. So each sport that we do has a different tempo, literally. And the way how I approach announcing is the exact same way how I approach a musical performance. What's the sport? What's the game? What are the two teams, if there are two teams playing? What are the athletes who are competing are doing? What are their stories up to that point? And along with all the preparation that I do with the information, with the research, all the stats and whatnot, there's also the big picture as well. And how are you able to convey that story in literally 3 or 4 minutes, depending on your pregame show, or your halftime show, or your postgame show? How are you able to convey that story? And then especially during each play, how do you approach each play? And especially in sports like hockey and basketball, which are very fast-paced, and there's always a play happening at every second of time, and almost every millisecond of time. As an announcer, I have to be proportionate as to what's going on. Not every play is going to be a game-winning play. Not every play is going to be a goal scored. Not every play is going to lead to a successful play or successful pass or whatever. So being able to leverage that tempo and to leverage that dynamic range and that phrasing, literally, in a literal sense, with word phrasing, is really important, especially when you can only have about 2 to 4 words per action to describe per action. Because if you go too long into it, if you ramble, you're behind. So that kind of explanation is so good, because it's also a great analogy even in sports announcing, and that's why great sports announcers and sportscasters have stayed for so long at the levels that they do, because they are able to master that even when they're announcing other things and announcing sport. And when you brought up the Ballade No. 1 by Chopin, as someone who has performed that in the past numerous times, it's a great example, because it starts, it says it's in G minor, but it doesn't start on G. So that sense of doubt, even from a notation perspective, is already very, very apparent. Let alone that slow inching, that slow storytelling that comes from that. Even the way how I was taught that piece, it's like every other piece, you have to tell a story. But here it's almost like, my interpretation of it's almost like a war story almost, right? That's explained in about 7 to 10 minutes, depending on how long the performance takes. So being able to unite all these different passages and being able to have a question and answer, a conversation, a musical conversation between the different voices in each line in each bar. That's something that's so difficult. It's easy to learn in some aspect, but it's also so difficult to master. Very, very difficult to master. And I think every musician, regardless of age, regardless of when they perform, regardless of level, I think that's a constant learning experience that each and every musician, each and every one of us has to go through when we're doing that. And yeah, I think that's, again, that was a great explanation of that.
Thanks. No, it's just I'm glad, because in a way, like, yeah, it's true. I think that's the ultimate learning curve, like almost forever learning curve, is phrasing. I think that's the real difficulty, but also where the real substance of music making is the ability to phrase as if you were speaking or singing in such a way that was comprehensible, as if it was words, as if it was. And yeah, I think that's the ultimate pursuit. That's the most noble pursuit, because by phrasing also, it's a way to also alter the state of time, or to alter this, to alter even the state that you're in, like the gravity, like the viscosity of the air, where you are, all that stuff. I think the ability to manipulate, you have the ability to manipulate that, in subtle ways that serve to create the kind of atmosphere that you want to create. And I think there's a way to do that is so incredibly, like, noble, as you look at someone, again, like the Horowitzes and the Heifetzes and all those, like, again, speaking as someone who will first always refer to 20th century people because I grew up with them. But I mean, there's a lot these days as well that, but I mean, just like when you look at great musicians who are able to do that, it's as if they were speaking, and I think there is an unspoken understanding there as well among the audience. I'm sure that they can feel it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. They feel it, and sometimes they're also vocal about it as well. So yeah, it's very much there. That feeling is definitely going to be there in a good performance. So as you're preparing for a piece, to what extent do you use the original composer's written philosophy in your performance of the piece? And in general, to what extent do you incorporate your musical philosophy in such a performance? How do you find the balance between that? Or do you have an entirely different approach to what I just described?
Well, it's interesting because, in violin, you deal with in a way, a very large variety of different approaches, depending on, let's say, what kind of period of music that you're dealing with, or, like, also the question of, for example, something physical, Baroque bow versus normal bow, gut strings versus synthetic modern strings, or Baroque setup violin versus modern violin, all these things. And of course, that's a very literal example of trying to go to the source, to the kind of the treatises and all that stuff, is that people, by going back to the tools in which Baroque composers like Bach and Telemann and Vivaldi, the way the instruments with which they envisioned their pieces, it's like you get to an understanding of articulation, of the lightness of the music, perhaps, of what kind of general attitude to approach it with. I think that's very important. I think it's funny when there's still cases, I guess, of people who insist on approaching, Baroque music in a romantic manner, or, let's say, like, just because maybe it's the manner that they grew up with. But I think that just open-mindedness, I think, is a very it's a quality that can take you a long way. Even if, let's say, if you don't end up, it's like you don't necessarily have to switch to Baroque bow every single time you play Bach, but at the same time, it's like that knowledge that is imparted on you by, first of all, playing a Baroque bow, and then reading, let's say, about the kind of sensibilities that they had back in the day, when those tools were the standard, like what kind of articulation to be had and all that stuff that you can always bring back into your approach, However, I think that, again, it's like that balance is an interesting question because it goes back to, again, always going back to Horowitz, I find, like, because Horowitz being such an individual, individual personality and all that, but at the same time was approaching. You could never say that Horowitz was indulgent, in the sense that he was, let's say, you get the sense that he was using music for his own selfish reasons, or for kind of thing. It was always, let's say, trying to bring it out. I think that's, in a way, I think it's important to find yourself within the music, like to find from whatever part of yourself the inspiration for that music comes. What side of you does that music bring out of you? I think like those are interesting questions to be posed, and that feeling, in a way. I think, like, whenever I'm asked how to first approach a piece that you're not familiar with, or whether it's a new piece, that feeling goes a bit like the initial reactions toward a piece, the initial emotional markers you have, the feelings that you have, let's say, when you first read a score, when you first listen to something, like, those are valuable in a sense that, like, that actually can already point you in a certain expressive dimension. But then also, even in, let's say, more nerdy, specific considerations as well, like, for example, stylistic things like articulation or vibrato and all this stuff, I think that can go a long way, that feeling. Like, just to go with your initial, what initial reactions you have, and not to forget that, even when you're still learning about, let's say, other approaches, or when you're learning about, let's say, getting experience from different viewpoints, but not to lose that.
Yeah. Being able to maintain your own identity and having to follow your instinct and to follow that gut feeling is such an important and crucial aspect of being a musician. And even you talked about the physical aspects about bowing in the Baroque bowing or modern techniques. There's a similar thing also in piano as well, with how classical era pianism compared to modern era pianism. So, as you know, the structure, the way how the piano was constructed has evolved greatly over the last 300 to 400 years or so. We started out with the harpsichord and the clavichord. Now there's similarly plucked percussive instruments. It wasn't until around the early to mid 1700s when the first pianos came on the stage. J.S. Bach was able to see some of these new pianos as in his late years before he passed away rather. He saw just the potential of that, and one of his sons, C.B.E. Bach, would write a very crucial essay on the art of playing keyboard instruments, and it's literally entitled that. Actually, it's the translation from the original German, and even the way how they number the fingering for each piece back in the classical era is actually somewhat different from how modern fingering numbers are. And frankly, I think the modern methods are better because it allows for easier performances of that passage, and it allows for even a much more expansive horizon of pianism as a whole. As we would see with Liszt and other similar piano virtuosos of the time, they were able to push the boundary of pianism to such an extent, of course, building off of the classical era philosophy, but they were also able to build on that and expand and even replace some of the not so good elements of previous era pianism. And that kind of mechanic changed the history of pianism. And even the tuning methods are also very crucial. Leonard Gilbert, in a conversation that I had with him in the past, mentioned in one of his papers that even the way how we tuned the piano is different from how we did back in the past. So nowadays we have temper tuning, right? So every tone is just ever so out of tune. But When you play them all together, it's all mellow, it's all great, it matches any scale. But back in the old days, they tuned the piano to a specific scale, or a specific key, I should say. So for that particular key, let's use C major, for example, truly perfect, truly in tune perfect for C major. But if you were to play other scales, that's when you started seeing some of the differences. So even that kind of tuning method, and even to go even more technical, today, most places use the A440 concert pitch standard. And that's almost universal across most places around the world. But there's also A432 and other pitches, which are just ever so slightly under the A440 standard. But there's a very noticeable difference. You and I both having perfect pitch, we would definitely hear that difference, because it changes. That ever so slight difference in hertz, that difference of about 8 hertz, changes everything about the tone of the piece. It sounds a lot more mellower or brighter, depending on what it is. And the emotions that it expresses with that ever so slight tweak in sound frequency, and that tuning frequency rather, does wonders. It changes everything about a performance. So that mechanic even influences the philosophy that comes out of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's funny to think of all the considerations that we have, that can influence, let's say, the impression of what's coming out, tuning. I mean, for us, even it's something that we have to deal with, whether it's not even just one type of tuning, but before that, like even whether we can play in tune or not, because that's, for violin, that's always a constant challenge. But it's interesting, like just the amount of considerations that there are, and also like the question also as we let's say play pieces that were written by composers in the past and how they, let's say, are played today, and also what the idea that, let's say, if composers were alive today, would they be making use of, let's say, how would they're making use of, let's say, current trends or current tools or current ways of doing about things, fingerings and stuff like that? How would that continue to evolve, and how would that actually, and what does that speak for us actually, as methods continue to evolve? How do we continue to adapt that, or how does that affect our way of interpreting pieces going forward? And is there such thing as an evolution of interpretation? Of course, because again, how we did things compared to 100 years ago is very, very different. Again, like even something as specific as fingering, but also just like the general sound that we look for, and how does that continue to, and is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? These things, it just shows like the amount of breadth that there is, and all that can create noticeable and meaningful differences in approach between, different artists even, and how we think about things. I think that's, it's something that keeps us on our toes, I think.
Yeah, and the another thing that also has really developed over the last couple of years is even competitions have evolved in the sense that, at least for the Chopin competition, there's now a period instrument competition. So because of the evolution, especially with piano, especially with how piano sounded with Chopin's original pianos, the Pleyel, if you played a piece on his original Pleyel pianos, very different sound from a modern piano. Very, very different sound. So now there's also a criteria as to what it would have sounded like. What's the best interpretation or the most accurate interpretation of a piece or a piece of repertoire on a period instrument? So from the piano perspective, very much, I think the answer is yes. There has been a very, very deep and rich evolutionary history into how pieces are interpreted. And now some piano manufacturers, such as Bösendorfer, are now actually increasing the range now. If you saw the Bösendorfer, I forgot which number it was, but it was one of their larger concert grands. Now they're adding an extra octave, I would even want to say at the end. It's like, wow, that is, and when you hear it, it's like, wow, it's something else. And it's colored black. The white keys are colored black. But the thing is, no or almost no repertoire has been written for something like that. So it remains to be seen how modern composers will approach that. I mean, I'm thinking about people like Alma Deutscher. She composes more for the violin and also for operas, but also being versed in piano, I think if she does choose to use that sort of extra octave at the end, I really want to see how that's going to play out in terms of competitions, because that is going to be potentially a fascinating thing. Some musicians are like, it's kind of nothing, but who knows? You never know. I mean, there's nothing in life is static, and classical music is no exception to that. So yeah, who knows?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, right? It's like, who was it? Lao Tzu said that, like, nature never rushes, but yeah, everything is accomplished. Like how a lot of these things, I guess, it's hard to imagine, or it's funny to try and imagine, I guess, like the places of innovations that they will take in the future and how long it will take. But at the same time, I think it's definitely going to happen. That composers are going to make use of, that tools, first of all, are going to continue to evolve, and that there's going to be new, even subtly new ways of doing things, and that there's going to be more of a breadth. I think it just shows one of those things that, like, within the classical music realm, things are continuing to evolve. Like, things are not stagnant. I think it's one of the main evidence for that.
Yeah.
And that to me is quite exciting.
Yeah. And one thing that you've also done is back in 2011, when you had your fundraiser concert, the Raising Hope with Music fundraiser concert for the Fukushima nuclear disaster, you actually played the soprano saxophone in an improvisational performance. So you showed your abilities in improvisation, and also, to a certain extent, even in jazz theory and jazz performance. So I'm curious as to what extent do you apply the musical approaches and philosophies of jazz in your performances nowadays, and to what extent do the classical and jazz approaches and philosophies and even theory intersect in your performances, aside from just basic notation?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely, like, it's all one, or there can be a big continuum of things. And even in just the attitude, I find, like, to approach every single classical performance as if you were playing the piece for the first time, or as if you were playing it with the kind of spark with which you would discover a piece for the first time. I think that's one thing that I would, the inspiration that you would have in the moment, trying to find the notes that you're going to play, or playing just what's at heart, basically, like in the middle of an improvisation. I think that's the same attitude that I would try and take away, even when you're playing something like, for example, Tchaikovsky or Sibelius concerto, standard things in the repertoire that you would play over and over again, or play many times in your career, like to try and, like, in a sense, that's the main inspiration, is to try and find something fresh every single time. And yet, not for the sake of finding something fresh, but just for the sake of, like, getting to the heart of the music, in accordance to what your state is that day, but just letting almost the moment take you. I think so, that kind of improvisatory attitude towards something that is written down, just because it's written down doesn't mean that it's undeserving of spark, of spark in the moment. It's like, in fact, it's actually what is entombed there is, like, the spark of inspiration with which the composers composed that piece with at the very beginning, what spurred them to, it wasn't just for the sake of academic exercise that they would write these pieces, but it was because of, let's say, some internal need to do so, and to try and capture that same energy when you're performing. I think that's definitely it's a cool thing. It's a cool thing. And just in terms of also, like, getting in, even if it's like basic, whether it's getting familiar with different scales, the blues scale, or with other stuff like that. Because in a way, I mean, for me, playing saxophone was just something that it was like a side project. It was something I dabbled in, but didn't sort of, but at the same time, that was still, like, it gave you inspiration in the sense that it would fill your ears with almost like unusual sounds. Different scales give you different colors, and provide you also, like, another angle with which you can view something that's already existing, like, you know, the notes on the classical piece that you already know, and to try and, because I think in order to, let's say, do justice to a piece, but in a way that seems fresh, or the way that hasn't been imagined before, that kind of thing, in the same way that Horowitz did, the first thing that you would have is an incredibly powerful vision of what you want to happen. It's like it doesn't come with excessive practice. It comes first of all from a vision, right, from that. And I think the more that you have fueling that kind of reservoir of, you know, your palette, that is, the more that you have, whether from experiencing different colors, which is from different styles, different scales, different musical experiences, the more that you can actually conjure up something of that nature, I find.
Yeah. And that kind of experience, we even see this also in people like Bruce Lee, you know, in his own philosophy, in his own, you know, martial arts prowess. Many people actually look to him as the father of MMA in a way, because he was able to pick pieces of what worked best in different traditional martial arts and put them into one. Now, Jeet Kune Do itself is not exactly, you know, a fully comprehensive martial art, but it was like the beginnings of something that would lead on to, you know, the philosophy of taking what's best from everything and taking from your own experience and putting it together. And that was what was so important in the world of martial arts. Same thing with music. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's important that some of the old elitist traditions of classical music that needs to be, you know, torn down, because if it doesn't work, if it doesn't add any genuine value to the performance itself, or even to access the general access to these performances, then you're not doing anything good for classical music. You're actually hurting it in a long-term sense as well. And yeah, that's just my honest opinion about like the whole state of everything that's been going on. But it has been getting better from what I've seen, especially with YouTube, you know, with your YouTube channel and with guys like Two Set Violin and other musicians who have also had a YouTube or social media presence. It has been getting better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's, you know, I think the whole thing about accessibility and, you know, the sort of people's perception of being able to get into classical music is just being able to get into it. You know, there's really no barrier there in a sense. It's like what it is what it is. And I think our role these days, like whether it's ambassadors like Two Set Violin in sort of an influencer sense, but also as musicians going out to bring music to the people without much expectation, really. It's just sort of like I'm sharing with you in a very simple manner what I'm doing. And that immediately, I think, is a gateway into something, into a different world for many people. As simple as that. But yeah, I mean, going back to also your previous point about just taking what works, you know, the whole thing about MMA and all that stuff. I mean, that's definitely something that resonates with me very much. It's like, in a sense, it's like you don't need to belong to any one tradition, but just to create or to even to combine the best toolbox that you want, that serves your purpose best. You know, that's been a big marker of my philosophy of violin playing, I think, for a number of years now. But I think it's in a way there's a certain amount of courage required to do that, because of course we learn via tradition often. You know, in classical music, that's very much a big thing. But I think to go outside of that and to almost go outside the box and to question what you've learned, that takes quite amount of courage, I find. But I think it's necessary. And I think you do find a lot of interesting energy these days, whether in something even like as specific as, let's say, the Baroque scene in France or in the Netherlands, you know, like just people thinking up new methods or taking up, you know, what is historically, let's say, informed, but with a new energy, with an open mind. I think going at things with an open mind is quite yeah, it's something courageous and needs to be done. I mean, as much as also that you can go overboard with it, but at the same time, I think there is a conversation to be had there, and in a direct way that it can also not only influence how music making evolves in the future, but also the way in which we, the artists, not only, let's say, people come to us, but we come to them as a way of sharing, right? I think it's definitely become a very important role, I guess, for musicians these days.
It certainly has.
It's also,
yeah, absolutely. It certainly has. And even revisiting past pieces in our own performance has also been something that has been a core experience for many of us as well as musicians. I mention this because, I'll give you an example. Like for myself, when I first performed the Franz Liszt's Après une lecture Dante Fantasia Quasi Sonata, or the Dante Sonata, back in my teenage years, and when I revisited it back in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic, my approach to it was very different from how I approached it in my teenage years, right? Aside from it being a technically difficult piece, musically wise, since I've grown since being in high school, now that at the time I was in law school and having to, having an extra 10 or so years of experience or whatnot, my approach to it was different. So you had an even better example in the sense that, to remind our audience, you performed the Zigeunerweisen at the 2010 International Menuhin Competition. You were 13 at the time. Well, in 2021, you once again performed the Zigeunerweisen, this time with an ensemble instead of a full orchestra. So, to what extent has your approach to the Zigeunerweisen changed between 2010 and 2021? And in general, in your experience, to what extent has your approach to previous pieces that you performed in the past changed upon your revisiting of such pieces at a later point in your life?
Yeah, that's a great question, because specifically when it comes to Zigeunerweisen, something like that, because it's meant to be gypsy music. It's meant to be, it captures something quite primal in a way. And of course, I mean, when I was 13, of course, I would still be thinking about expressing myself in a piece, because in a way, those are the kind of pieces where you can be quite unrestrained. You don't actually have much to consider. It's just sort of like pure emotion goes a long way, kind of thing. Those are the kind of pieces. But I mean, there's something about, like, for example, the element of sorrow, the element of nostalgia, maybe, the sense of longing that people, let's say, wanderers may feel, wandering around, never really having a permanent a stem or roots in the world. You're always just constantly, that there's a sense of nostalgia, there's a sense of longing in those kind of, especially in the lyrical sections, I find, that I would, let's say, bring out more these days from my own experience as well, sometimes, traveling a lot and seeing, let's say, the kind of states of emotion that you would go through, how the ups and downs would happen and all that stuff. That's maybe something that would not necessarily be so apparent to a 13-year-old yet, and to play as if, again, I'm thinking mostly of the lyrical sections, but as, let's say, a kind of, a commemoration of something, or a kind of, as a real expression of longing, let's say, having a specific purpose in mind. I think those are the things that would be more apparent to you when you get older, because it's something that becomes more relatable, let's say. And that's the thing about, that's the thing about reinterpreting pieces in general, because I find that, you have to almost address, like, go back to why, or you can imagine the purpose with which the composers compose these pieces. Often, let's say, there will be catalyst moments in their lives that that spark the creation of these pieces. And often, unfortunately, it would be negative emotion, let's say, that drives a lot of that, or the desire for something, or again, longing, or, these kind of things. I find that or to get closer to the source of, or to spark the sort of the essence of each piece in a simple sense, like encompassing these kind of emotions. I find that becomes more and more apparent in over time, and that would also influence, let's say, the way that you would try and again alter the gravity of the notes, create whatever kind of field of gravity below the notes, how you're able to squeeze things out, or how you're able to, let's say, alter again the states, something in suspension, something in motion, something in that's less easygoing, something that's more easygoing. These kind of things I find become a little bit clearer as you go along, just because then I think the more and more you do it, the more that it's apparent that certain emotions can be translated in a certain way violinistically that doesn't require then much explanation. It's sort of like, okay, this is the toolbox that I have. This is my understanding of phrasing. This is the understanding of, let's say, what kind of tone colors I'm able to produce. And then whatever feeling comes to mind, then it's like you take that and you see how it translates violinistically. That process is a little bit more direct, I find, as you get older. You don't actually have to think about the mechanics of emotion as much, but like you're more able to actually focus on almost transcending the instrument, and then so that process is different.
Yeah, I experienced that too, even in my own revisiting of previous pieces in the past. It's the same thing for me, not having to think about the mechanics of emotion, because I already know how to emote, so to speak, how to express myself, right? Both in the musical sense and also in a humanistic sense as well. So it's like a different stage of life, and then that different stage of life allows you more breadth and more depth also into how you approach a piece. We've gone through so much material and so many different topics within musicality and music in general. It doesn't change the fact that there are still so many misconceptions that you and I have personally experienced in terms of explaining classical music, and also for other people understanding the world of classical music. What are the biggest misconceptions that you have personally experienced throughout your entire life from other people looking at classical music?
Maybe the misconception that it's only for a small group of people, for a very specific group of people, whether it's people who understand it already or have studied it, or even just for a particular group, like in society, let's say, which I don't think is the case. I think it's also just going back to the manner of how to introduce, how to just say, hi, how are you, but with music, kind of thing. Just reaching out in a simple way like that, not even like presenting it as something that you have to do, but rather something that is something that can add richness to your life as it has mine, and yours, like I think that's as simple as that, just a simple, a simple greeting like that. I find that's in a way, it goes a long way, because it really doesn't have to be, I think that, of course, that more elitist viewpoint, or like the elitist image of classical music, comes from, let's say, the fact that it was, the concert halls have been kind of big bulwarks, have been kind of inaccessible, and kind of, there's something that almost seems like secret societies in a way, going into a concert hall lobby and feeling a little bit of it. Whereas I think that, of course, the concert halls are the temples for us. But I think also, if musicians find a way to open also their senses of communication, not to, let's say, only play concerts in a traditional sense, but also to go out and to spread it around themselves in humble circumstances even. I find that's, I think it has a lot of potential to combating that.
Yeah, yeah. Great words to to be said, because I remember back in my old days when I was younger, there were many people who actually bullied me for my own passion into classical music and classical music performance. Especially since we both live in Canada. Canada is one of those countries in the developed world that doesn't really have a strong, or at least a strong enough culture for classical music in general. And this is going to be a little bit of a controversial take, but I think I would argue that in the last 30 to 40 years, there's actually been a decline, at least in the mainstream, for that. It's changed recently in terms of your historic win in 2010, and also with Bruce Liu's historic win at the 2021 International Chopin Competition. That was when, for the first time, and at least in my own memory, where I saw mainstream coverage of classical music. I mean, I never would have thought that breakfast television in Toronto would actually feature Bruce Liu's championship, and I shouldn't say championship, competition winning performance of one of Chopin's piano concertos on morning television for all Canadians tuning in to see. Like that was just like, whoa. Like it was whoa. And then CBC The National also covered it as well. So that was also like, wow. But it still doesn't change the fact that there's still that kind of animosity even later on, even nowadays, I still run into that once in a while. What are some of the ways that you think Canada can improve its classical music culture? And how can we teach the importance of musicality in general to people who have little to no idea about classical music?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in a way, starting with the fact that classical music is something that, again, is not an obligation in a sense. It's like, or at least I think that it harms it. I think it harms classical music to think of it as, let's say, a obligation for depth or for whatever. It is, of course, I think, a reflection of depth, especially considering the direction the world has headed in, like the way that even the world has changed. The pace of the world has changed over the last 30, 40 years, which has been unprecedented, which has been exponential. And I think, of course, there is a natural challenge of how classical music, which is something that takes time, in a sense that, like, okay, learning an instrument, versus, let's say, the typing of notes into a computer, into a MIDI program, or into a digital audio workstation these days. It's something that does take time, and therefore, there is just less time these days. There is less of an attention span, I think, also for a Mahler symphony. As much as I think that if someone was, if as much as I think if there was the ideal situation or an ideal circumstance made so that someone could actually sit there without feeling as if they need to be somewhere else and actually listen to a Mahler symphony, I'm sure that the power of that symphony will take over. But I think, of course, still there is that consideration of attention span and of time. How time these days, they move so fast, and there isn't, let's say, as much time to stay in the moment, let's say, which is one of the main qualities of classical music. It takes you to a different time and to a different place. Again, I think it's something to do with, I think, ideally, I think from the personality of the people who are bringing classical music to the public, so the performers. I think that there is something there. However, it also creates dangers, I find, to make something that is not inherently demonstrative, or to, let's say, to feel as if the presentation of such an art becomes more important than the art itself in consideration for yourself. I mean, like, for an artist, there are certain dangers there, but I think, like, in terms of, like, again, going forth just with the desire to show people, not even to show people, but just to live your life live an example, I guess, as a classical musician, the dedication, the beauty, all that stuff in front of other people, without, let's say, the explicit, the explicit want or need to convert, let's say, because people are going to latch onto what they latch onto, even if it's classical music, whether it's a genre, there's always going to be preferences. But I think like just to be able to have that attitude of going into the field and revealing what you do in a simple manner, playing the role of a simple ambassador. Everyone's going to connect with a simple melody. Everyone's going to connect with a musical performance in some way. And I think that's the way to start. I feel like, of course, it could also be that sometimes when it comes to people, being getting into classical music a bit daunting. It's because there's maybe such a grand structure there that that in order to feel as if to feel the need to understand such a thing, which in the end is not needed. You only have to feel it again, but there is an understanding or an impression that you need to understand everything in order to, that basically causes people to give up, maybe, or to feel too much of an enormity of the task of getting into such a thing. Whereas I think that if you start incrementally, if you just sort of like even from a simple melody into a simple phrase, into a simple, like starting incrementally, I think is a great way to do that. And in the end of the day, music is music. Good music is good music in a sense that it has an impact on people, and I think that if there isn't any pretension attached to it, if there isn't, let's say, any other kind of like air of superiority or air of whatever, I think if you're just going there just to share what you love, I think that already goes a long way. And I mean, it's only really like these kind of basic interactions, and then over time that we can see an impact on, let's say, even education systems, that the value of something like that is worth having around, for that relationship to come to take place. I think that what happens before that, the grassroots efforts, just like being able to go out there and social media is a great tool these days for that, because it's, in a way, it democratizes everything. It makes information very accessible, and you can reach people. I think that's, in a way, a starting point for those that want to be ambassadors for classical music.
Yeah. And another challenge that we face also is trying to explain difficult concepts in a way that is easily understandable to a non-trained or a lay person in the world of music. Like, for example, in the world of violin, and you know this better than I do, even just the types of violin and the makes of the violins are also very, very crucial to how the music sounds. Like a Strad versus a Del Gesù. You play in the Del Gesù now, and even back then when after you won the Menuhin competition, you were also playing on a Del Gesù at the time. And even knowing that difference, to an average layperson, all they would just see are just two names. And the first misconception that they would have is, oh, it's just names. It's just, nostalgia for the past. It's just, this elitist whatever, it's just, there's no difference. But to a trained listener, especially a trained violinist, there is a difference. So explaining that, even from like a violinist perspective, that's also a challenge, because how do you break off the elitist part, and how do you explain the intricacies of that sound and the musicality that comes from a Strad versus a Del Gesù to a person who has no idea, who can't even tell a violin from a double bass, even, and I want to say I'm exaggerating, but we're in a day and age where some people actually literally can't tell a difference. They just say violin, big violin, that kind of thing. So, but that kind of challenge is also really difficult, right? It's one of so many difficult challenges that we have, but I think being able to explain it is perhaps like one of the most important skills that we have.
I think in the case of violin or in the case of string instruments, I think to find a way that relates to people in the sense that you can use the voice. You know, how we can discern what is a low voice, what a high voice, what's a different timbre of voice, what's the vowel sound. You know, all these things. I think that if you use even in this sort of a specific task of describing the differences between one violin and the other, you know, it's like how to put it so that you're almost describing different voices, the qualities of different voices. And I think that's just putting things in perspective of what they know already or what is universal to all of us, the voice, whatever it might be. You know, I think it's a way to go about it for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So with all this that we've been able to go through today, what are the most rewarding things that you've learned, that you've witnessed rather, in your career thus far? And what are the greatest lessons that you've learned in your career thus far?
I think to never give up. It's maybe a cliche, but I think it's really something that's worth keeping in mind, to always constantly be evolving, to always to never feel as if you've done it all, to never be complacent, that is, in a way. I think that's something that I've taken away, that in a way to connect, to find commonalities between people, like as a way of connecting people. I think music is one of those universal things, like food, like whatever it might be, you know, like those universal things where people can immediately sort of like, you know, not only connect, but also get a measure of what you are, you know, get to learn a little bit of your background, or, you know, I think it's one of those powerful forces, in a way to embrace those for the sake of creating meaningful connections between people. And in a way, I mean, as a musician, I feel there's a responsibility there, but I also feel like it's an honor to do that. It's an honor to play a role doing that. You know, in the end of the day, it's sort of like, it's not about personal glory, because there's no such thing. In the end of the day, you know, everyone's going to also like experience an ascent, you know, a climax, or let's say prime state, and a decline, you know, because we are, you know, we're human. But at the same time, within that, it's like, how much good can you do, right? It's like with music, there is a great power in the way that, let's say, you're able to provide catharsis, let's say, or to potentially each performance to be a life-changing one for audience members. You know, like, I think I always remind myself that every time I play a piece, even if I've played it 50 times in the past, there's always one person in the hall that's heard it for the first time, and someone who's going to hear it for the last time, you know? And so, like, that's something that makes me take what I do very, you know, not like overly seriously, but like gives a weight to what you do, you know, and to the whole purpose of making music, which is to almost be a messenger for what connects us, you know? And that has also taught me also about like the importance of personal relationships in life, more than material goods, more than personal glory, more than creating your own sense of hierarchy. Let's say the personal relationships, I find, are those that, in a way, I think will have weight, you know, over time. Like, those are the things that you really do value and will remember. And funnily enough, it was music making that really hit it home for me, like hit that concept home, in a sense. It's like, just to be able to, like, through playing chamber music, you communicate and you make compromise. And that's the way to play chamber music, you know, because in order to make 4 people, even 2 people fit together is not always easy. To make 3 people, exponentially more difficult. 4 people, exponentially, you know. So, like, in the same way, it's like, in order to, like, chamber music teaches you about communication, about being able to reach a compromise in some way. It teaches you about human nature, and it teaches you about, like, you know, human connection. But I think, so in a way, I would see myself much less from an individualistic point of view now. Of course, I am my own person, and I take care of, let's say, I want to take care of myself the best that I can do, because that's the source of it all for me, from my perspective. But then also, like, to really value what other people bring, and to value those relationships, because I think those are the things that you'll remember in the end. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And not staying complacent and continuously pursuing and being at your best, that is such an important thing to do. So with that, where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Perhaps in Europe. Just personally, I've always seen myself living in Europe at some point. I think I'll probably be there at that point for sure. But also just like doing what I'm doing now, but perhaps, going on, let's say, a further development of paths, whether in assuming different additional roles in music, not just a violinist, but maybe a composer, maybe increasingly an educator, maybe, but of course doing more and more performing. But I feel like it's also hard to say, because in 5 years these days, it feels like the amount the world changes every 5 years, it feels like 50 years even, in terms of like the technological and societal advancements that we have, like right now, like look at AI, like it's hard to imagine what's going to happen 5 years from now. But I would say, like, just to continue, the most important thing, continue with the kind of purpose that I've, that I live with, not to lose sight of that, but also to just to continue to make the kind of meaningful connections, and to try and spread more and more of what I do.
Yeah, great 5-year plan. And as we start to close this episode, what advice would you give to aspiring violinists and to those who want to become the next International Menuhin Competition champion?
Yeah, I would say to find your why, as to ask that question, even if it may be a bit daunting, to ask that as early as possible. I find to have something to play for, that's a very powerful motivator. And it gets you through the difficult moments, because surely there will be. The violin, I have to say, is a very unreasonable instrument, in the sense that it twists your body and it requires a lot of strenuous activity. And maybe, unfortunately, there's going to be injuries. You're going to get hurt, and you're going to get discouraged, because it is a very steep learning curve. Even just to learn how to draw the bow on the string, I think that's immediately something it's very different from, let's say, just being able to press a key on a piano and then immediately making a relatively decent sound, kind of thing, right? But I would say to take it slow, to trust in the process. I think what you see in whatever perhaps aspires you to pursue the same path, let's say, like, the images of people, soloists on stage with the flowers and the applause and all that, that's only the very, very tip of the iceberg, in a way. Those are, like, in a way, very uncommon moments in one's life of music. I think the majority of it is the process. And to think as if, let's say, the process is something that you need to go through in order to get to, I think that's the wrong mentality. In fact, I think to think of the process itself as inherently valuable, and to enjoy the process, therefore, to find a way to tell yourself that this is important in itself, regardless of who's watching, because at the end of the day, who cares about that, right? You know, this is all about for yourself, like to find yourself. And so I would say to enjoy the process, to enjoy the little details in the same way that you would try and enjoy the little details in everyday life. So I would say, especially with the violin, to never lose track of that, because there's going to be ups and downs, but at the same time, there's ups and downs in life, but there is a constant, that takes you through all of that. I think that allows you to transcend that, which is, in this case, the process itself, So I would say, just enjoy the process, enjoy the little details, and try and work on your technique for the sake of bringing joy to those around you, instead of, let's say, being the best at something.
That's because a good one.
Often I find it actually takes you further.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. The old saying always goes, it's not always about the destination, it's about the journey. And it's also about the friends we made along the way on the journey as well. So that's a great way to end this on. And wow, we've gone through a lot of content today, many different ideas, deep dive into your career, deep dive into musicality. It's been a great time talking with you, catching up with you, Kerson. It's been a long time since we last spoke, since about 4 years ago, almost 4.5 years ago. So really great to catch up with you. Thank you so very much for coming on to the podcast, and thank you for sharing the living legend of Kerson Leong.
Thanks, Amos. No, this was a long conversation, but it was very enjoyable and very meaningful. So, thank you for bringing me on. And it's great that you're doing this kind of work, with your podcast. And I think it's something that adds a lot of, that brings a lot, and it adds a lot to whoever's listening. So I think, I'll continue on with that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind words. And thank you to our audience who has made it this far, all the way to the end of the interview. And thank you so much for tuning in to the very living legend of Kerson Leong. You can follow him on social media, on Instagram at Kerson Leong. Once again, at Kerson Leong. And you can also subscribe to his YouTube channel, also named Kerson Leong. Definitely support him in his journey, and we'll see what will happen, what amazing journeys and adventures he will go on for the next many years. Once again, you have listened or tuned into the legend of Kerson Leong. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also follow us on our own social media, and visit our website as well. And once you do that, you won't be missing any content that comes from us. You'll be always tuned in to a new update from us. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode, and be sure to stay tuned for more. Signing off for now, this is Amos Vang. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay legendary.